My roommate Kelly is the kind of person who jumps headfirst into everything, and that's how she found herself knee-deep in organizing a local art show. It was supposed to be a small, grassroots event, a place where indie artists could showcase their work without needing to shell out big money for space. She'd been planning it for months, pulling all-nighters, hyping it up online, and just a few days before the show, she was on her laptop in the living room, practically glowing with excitement. But the night of ticket sales, her expression turned grim. She stared at the screen, hitting refresh as tickets vanished in seconds. When she checked resale sites a little later, there they were at 4 times the price. Corporations, ticket bots, had bought up most of the seats, and now genuine fans were priced out. "It's like they're scalping joy," she said bitterly, shutting her laptop. "What's next? Reselling air?" That same frustration with the system hit close to home a week later when my dad called me, sounding a little off. He's one of those people who believes in hard work and has been at the same job for decades. He was up for a promotion, the type he'd been working toward for years. After months of interviews and project presentations, it felt within reach. But last minute, his boss dropped the bomb that they were going with a different direction. No explanation, no thanks for the work he'd put in, just a cold email and a best of luck send-off. "Guess loyalty means nothing," he muttered, trying to sound nonchalant, but I could hear the disappointment. 2 days later, I found myself at the DMV to renew my license, where I spent hours sitting in a cold, fluorescent-lit room waiting for my number to be called. Just as my turn finally arrived, a loud, commanding voice boomed. "Line up." A police dog was let in, sniffing each of us as we sat there nervously. When the dog alerted on a teenager, they pulled him aside, made him empty his pockets, and frisked him right there. All eyes were on him, and you could see the embarrassment radiate off him in waves. When they found nothing, they just shrugged and moved on, leaving the kid to awkwardly reassemble his things, his face beet red. I walked out of the DMV that day wondering about that kid. The whole experience seemed to mirror a much larger issue. Authority figures making sweeping decisions, rarely considering the impact on the individual. They had the power, and that was the end of the conversation. Just like Kelly's ticket scalpers and my dad's unceremonious job letdown. A few nights later, I was grabbing drinks with some friends when the topic shifted to politics, as it often does these days. My friend Sam, who works in finance, was venting about yet another story of politicians trading stocks on insider knowledge. "They're supposed to work for us, but they're working for their portfolios," he said, looking genuinely troubled. We talked about how these same politicians push for legislation that conveniently benefits them, or their friends, or their interests. And yet, here we were doing our best to get by, having to play by rules they could sidestep whenever it suited them. My friend Riley chimed in, telling us about the privacy nightmare she'd been dealing with at her job. She works in tech, and part of her role involves analyzing user data. You wouldn't believe how much info we collect: location, search history, even stuff you didn't click on. She shook her head, as if trying to shake off the thought. It's scary how normal it's become. People think they're downloading a simple app, but in reality, they're handing over their entire digital life. She was telling us how some companies would disguise their data policies so it looked like they were harmless, even though they were selling that data to anyone willing to pay. Then there was the topic of gambling ads. Those relentless, omnipresent ads trying to lure people into throwing their savings away. Our friend Jake brought it up, saying how it was plastered all over TV, as if betting away your paycheck was just another quirky hobby. They banned cigarette ads, but gambling? That's a billion-dollar industry that's somehow fine, he said, rolling his eyes. Jake had watched his uncle lose a lot to gambling, slipping from stable to nearly bankrupt in just a year. It's not even about the freedom to gamble. It's about the fact that they're actively encouraging people to do it, knowing full well that it destroys lives. By now, we were all swapping stories about how things seemed to be spiraling. The system was rewarding greed, privacy was a joke, and real people were paying the price. I told them about Kelly's art show ticket fiasco and my dad's job letdown, and everyone just nodded. It was like we were all stuck watching everything around us be sold to the highest bidder. As we finished our drinks and settled the tab, my friend Mia sighed. It feels like we're fighting a rigged game. And she was right. There's a moment from a few years back that I still can't shake. It was one of those quiet fall afternoons, the kind that feels calm enough to make you forget that the world is anything but predictable. I decided to spend the weekend at my parents' cabin in the woods, hoping for a break from the constant rush of the city. There's no Wi-Fi, no cell reception, just trees, a lake, and the comforting silence that comes with it. I'd gone up there a dozen times before, but that weekend, things took a different turn. I'd been chopping wood that Saturday morning, stacking logs beside the cabin for the fireplace. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. After a couple of hours, I decided to take a break and went down to the lake with a thermos of coffee. I sat on an old, half-rotted dock, letting my feet dangle over the water. The surface was so still, it was like looking into a mirror, each ripple from my foot tracing slow arcs across it. I must have been lost in thought because I didn't hear the storm clouds roll in. It was only when a low rumble of thunder broke the silence that I realized the sky had darkened. I stood up, and in my rush to head back, my foot caught a loose plank. I stumbled, barely catching myself from toppling straight into the lake. I brushed it off, feeling a bit stupid for not watching my step. But something strange lingered, a slight tremble in my hand, a tightness in my chest. It wasn't the stumble itself. It was the vulnerability it highlighted, the reminder that one misplaced step, even in a place as familiar as that dock, could end badly. Back at the cabin, the rain had started coming down hard. It was the type of downpour that drowned out everything else, so loud it seemed like the entire world was wrapped in it. I settled in by the fire, watching the flames dance, letting the warmth sink in. I dozed off, but not for long. I woke to the sound of water, a strange sloshing noise echoing from under the cabin. It took a second to realize what was happening. The heavy rain was pooling around the foundation, and water had started seeping through a crack in the floorboards. I jumped up, my heart pounding, wondering if the cabin could flood. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, ducking through the sheets of rain to see if there was anything I could do. But just as I stepped off the porch, I felt a sickening, hollow snap under my foot. I had stumbled into a half-rotted patch of ground by the side of the cabin. My foot slid down into it, hitting something sharp on the way down. A wave of pain shot through my leg, and I jerked back, barely keeping my balance as I pulled my foot free. When I looked down, my boot was torn, blood seeping through where I'd cut myself. My mind raced. What if there was something worse buried under there? Rusted metal? A broken bottle? The thought of tetanus or infection flashed in my mind, and suddenly, the remoteness of the cabin felt like a curse rather than a blessing. I had no way to call for help, no first aid kit, nothing but my pocket knife and a few bandages in the cabin. I limped back inside, trying to calm down, telling myself I'd be fine. But that night, as the rain finally died down and I sat in front of the dwindling fire, I couldn't shake the feeling of being small, vulnerable. I wrapped my foot as best as I could, keeping it elevated, but I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind seemed louder, closer, as if the woods themselves were pressing in, reminding me of how alone I was out there. In those dark hours, the isolation that once felt peaceful became almost terrifying. The next morning, I was exhausted and sore, but I managed to hobble around enough to check on the damage. The ground outside was churned up and muddy, a mess of rotted leaves and soaked earth. I looked back at the patch where I'd nearly fallen through and saw something glinting in the dirt. A metal shard, probably part of an old, rusted-out barrel that had been buried and forgotten. It had been inches from my foot when I'd twisted it free. I realized that if I'd fallen just a little harder, landed a little differently, I could have been badly injured, bleeding and stranded without a way to get help. I felt a strange shiver crawl up my spine, and it wasn't from the cold. It was the creeping awareness of how close I'd come to a far worse situation, the realization that this peaceful retreat could have easily become a trap. I packed up and headed back to the city later that day, feeling a weight I couldn't quite shake. It wasn't just the cut on my foot or the close call with the storm. It was the knowledge that sometimes, even in places we feel safest, danger can creep in. We think we know what we're prepared for until life throws a reminder that we're never as in control as we'd like to believe. That weekend changed the way I looked at a lot of things. I made a mental note to be more prepared, even for the things I couldn't foresee. I got a proper first aid kit for the cabin, made sure I had backup supplies, and reminded myself to stay grounded, to pay attention to the details, even the ones that seem trivial. And as strange as it sounds, I think about that dock often, the loose plank, the cold lake beneath it. I think about how easy it is to misjudge our safety, to underestimate the risks that are right in front of us. I think of that rotted ground and the storm and the way isolation can shift from a friend to a foe in an instant. Life is full of small, hidden dangers, things that don't always seem like a threat until they're right on top of us. I don't let it consume me, but I do let it remind me of something crucial, that our safety isn't guaranteed, that our lives can pivot on the smallest of moments, and that even in our quietest, most familiar spaces, it's always worth staying just a little vigilant, a little cautious, to give ourselves a fighting chance against the unexpected. I'm a paramedic with over 10 years on the job. I've seen things most people only hear about on the news, and after a while, I thought I was immune to it all. The blood, the accidents, the overdoses, the things people do to each other and themselves. It just becomes another day at work. But there was one night that I can't shake. It's been months, and I still lie awake some nights, thinking about it, wondering if I could have done something differently, wondering if anyone could. It was a typical summer Friday, and we were expecting the usual chaos. Bar fights, drunken falls, heat stroke cases. Around 2 a.m., we got a call about an overdose. Not unusual for that time of night, especially near the city center. My partner and I were close, so we responded, figuring it'd be another routine call. Maybe a Narcan shot, a ride to the hospital, and then on to the next. When we arrived, the scene was already unsettling. It was an upscale apartment complex, the kind of place where residents don't call 911 lightly. A security guard met us at the entrance, looking pale and shaken. He barely got out the words, "It's bad, really bad," before leading us up the stairs. I tried to ask questions. How long had she been down? Did he know if she'd taken anything specific? But he just shook his head, muttering, "I don't know, she's not right." That was our first red flag. We reached the door, and as soon as we stepped inside, I knew this wasn't a normal overdose. The apartment was pristine, almost too perfect, like something out of a magazine. And then there was the smell, this sickly sweet, metallic scent I've only encountered in the worst scenes. It clung to everything, filling the room, making the air thick and hard to breathe. We found her in the bedroom, lying on her back, arms splayed out at her sides. Her skin was an eerie, waxy pale, and her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. I knelt down, checking her pulse, her pupils, trying to assess if she had any chance of coming back. But the instant I touched her, something felt wrong. Her body was stiff, far too stiff for someone who'd only been down for a few minutes. Rigor mortis usually takes hours to set in, but her muscles were locked tight, her jaw clenched, her eyes unblinking. I looked over at my partner, and he had the same stunned expression, both of us silently wondering what the hell we were dealing with. Despite her stiffness, I prepped a shot of Narcan, hoping it would reverse whatever she'd taken. I administered the dose, watching her face, waiting for any sign of life, but nothing changed. We started basic resuscitation, even though I knew in my gut it was too late. As we worked, I kept glancing around the room, noticing little details that didn't add up. There were no signs of drug paraphernalia, no empty pill bottles, no alcohol, nothing that would suggest an overdose. The only thing out of place was a notebook on the bedside table, its cover scuffed and worn. We worked on her for about 10 minutes, but there was no response. I called it time of death, 2:17 a.m. There was a weight in the room, a suffocating tension, like we were intruding on something we shouldn't be witnessing. As we started to pack up, my partner picked up the notebook, flipping it open to the first page. He scanned it quickly, his face going pale as he read. Without a word, he handed it to me. Inside, the pages were filled with entries, each one dated, each one detailing the same thing. A stranger, she said, had been watching her, following her for weeks. She described seeing him outside her window, in her rearview mirror, even in her dreams. The writing grew more frantic, more desperate as the days went on. She wrote that no matter where she went, He was always there, waiting. The last entry was from that same night, only a few hours before we arrived. It read, "Tonight is the night." He told me I can't run anymore. I felt a shiver run down my spine, the kind you can't just shake off. I've dealt with people in psychosis, people who hear voices or see things that aren't there, but there was a clarity in her writing, a sharpness that didn't feel like hallucination. My partner and I exchanged a look, neither of us saying what we were both thinking. We closed the notebook and left it for the investigators. Back at the station, the mood was heavy. We're used to tough calls, to situations that stick with you, but this one was different. There was an unsettled feeling hanging over us, like we'd stepped into something that went beyond our usual job. I couldn't stop thinking about the way she looked, that stiffness, her eyes frozen in terror. I kept going back to her final entry, replaying those words in my mind. He told me I can't run anymore. It sounded so final, like she'd known what was coming, like she'd given up. Over the next few days, I followed up out of morbid curiosity. I asked a detective I knew if they'd found anything, any evidence that might explain what had happened. He told me there were no leads, no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints other than hers. Toxicology came back clean. No drugs, no alcohol, nothing that should have stopped her heart. Officially, they listed her cause of death as natural causes, a phrase that made no sense in the context of what we'd seen. Months went by, but I couldn't shake it. I kept that call buried deep in the back of my mind, trying to file it away like every other hard night on the job. But then about 6 months later, we got another call. Similar situation. A young woman found unresponsive in her apartment, no signs of drugs or alcohol. She was dead by the time we arrived, her body stiff in that same unnatural way, her eyes wide, her face frozen in terror. As we worked on her, I noticed a notebook on her bedside table. I didn't open it. I didn't have to. I already knew what it would say. After that, I started to lose sleep. Night after night, I'd lie in bed, thinking about those women, their final moments, wondering if they'd really been running from something or someone, if they'd truly been alone in those rooms. The logical side of me knew there had to be an explanation, but part of me couldn't help feeling like we'd missed something. Like there was something lurking just outside our reach, something none of us wanted to see. Now, every time we get a call about an unresponsive patient, my heart skips a beat. I brace myself for that same smell, that same stiffness, those same empty eyes. And sometimes, late at night, I think about that first woman's final words, scribbled into that notebook with such desperation. The night I met Henry had started like any other Thursday at the Brass Tap, the tiny bar where I work part-time. It was one of those slow shifts with a few regulars at the bar and a couple of friends playing darts in the back. I had already begun mentally clocking out, planning the takeout I'd grab on the way home. When he walked in, he looked about 60, with a worn leather jacket and a quiet, far-off look in his eyes, like he was there and not there at the same time. He slid onto a bar stool and nodded at me. "Just a whiskey, neat?" I poured it, handing it to him with a quick smile, but he barely glanced at me. Just sipped his drink, staring at some invisible point across the room. Something about him struck me as off, but I'd learned not to pry. People came into bars to escape. After all, a few drinks in, he started to loosen up. He caught my eye as I was wiping down the bar and asked, "You ever seen something you can't explain? Something that makes you question everything?" I laughed a little, figuring he was just one of those guys who like to spout wisdom after a few rounds. "I guess that depends on what you mean." He leaned in, his eyes serious. "I saw something once. I still don't know if it was real." I couldn't help but be intrigued. "What did you see?" He took a long sip before he spoke, almost like he was trying to summon the courage to tell it. "I was a logger worked out in the backcountry. There was this one patch of forest up north, near the Canadian border, where no one would go. Locals said it was cursed, but we were young and needed the work, so we didn't think much of it. But that place, it did something to us." He paused, eyes distant, as if he were looking into that forest right then. We'd been working there a few days when strange things started happening. At first, it was little stuff. Tools going missing, shadows moving when they shouldn't. Then we started finding claw marks on the trees, massive ones way too high up for any animal in those parts. At night, We'd hear things, scratches, whispers, footsteps crunching in the underbrush. But whenever we shone our lights, there'd be nothing. I shivered a little, caught up in his story despite myself. "So what did you do?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. We tried to ignore it, told ourselves it was just the wind, maybe a bear passing through. But one night, I was on the late shift, keeping an eye on the equipment. The others were sleeping back at camp, about a mile down the trail. I'd set up a little fire to keep warm, but something about that night felt wrong. Like the air was too thick, too quiet. He looked at his empty glass, and I silently poured him another. "That's when I saw it," he said, voice barely a whisper. This figure, tall and thin, almost stretched out like it didn't fit in its own skin. It was standing just on the edge of the firelight, barely visible, but close enough I could see its eyes. They were too big, too black, and they looked straight through me like it was peeling me apart piece by piece. I swallowed, feeling a chill creep up my spine. "What did you do?" "What could I do?" He shook his head. I just sat there frozen like it had pinned me in place. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't listen. And it just stood there, watching me, until it slowly backed away, disappearing into the dark. He took a deep breath, rubbing his temples. After that, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I'd lie awake, convinced I could feel those eyes on me, even in broad daylight. We left a few days later, left all our equipment behind. Nobody asked why, and nobody's ever gone back. The whole area's been fenced off now. I didn't know what to say. The bar had fallen silent, as if the whole room was holding its breath, listening to his story. He finished his whiskey, giving me a sad smile. "I don't expect you to believe me. Hell, I barely believe it myself. But I can still feel it sometimes, like it's waiting out there, just beyond the light." With that, he stood up, leaving a couple of crumpled bills on the bar. As he walked out, he paused at the door, looking back at me with that same distant look in his eyes. "Be careful in the dark," he said softly. "Sometimes it's not just empty space." Then he disappeared into the night, leaving me with a story that would haunt me for years. Every time I worked the late shift after that, I'd find myself glancing at the edges of the room, half expecting to see something watching, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. And though I'd never admit it to anyone, I started keeping a small fire going outside my apartment on dark nights, just in case. When my phone rang, I didn't recognize the number, but it was 1:30 in the morning, and my gut told me to pick it up. Half asleep, I cleared my throat, preparing for anything from a wrong number to a friend in trouble. "Hello?" A woman's voice came through, panicked but familiar. "Ben? It's Emily. Emily, my ex, the one I hadn't spoken to in nearly a year." Hearing her voice hit me like a splash of ice water, instantly dragging me from sleep to wide-eyed confusion. "Emily? Art, are you okay? Can you come get me?" Her voice cracked, and I could tell she was crying. I wouldn't ask, but I don't know who else to call. I didn't need details. All I knew was that she was alone and scared, and there was no way I was going to leave her like that. I threw on some clothes, grabbed my keys, and told her to stay on the line. Her voice was shaky, and I could hear the muffled sounds of traffic and the occasional shout in the background. "I'm by the old train station," she said softly, "near the corner. I'll explain everything when you get here." The drive over felt surreal, memories flickering in the corners of my mind like scenes from a half-forgotten movie. Emily and I had dated for 2 years, and for a while it was good, really good. But things had gone south fast, ending with a messy breakup that neither of us handled well. Since then, I'd pushed her out of my mind, rebuilding my life piece by piece. And now, out of nowhere, she was back. I pulled up to the train station and spotted her instantly, sitting on a bench beneath a flickering streetlight. She looked small, lost, like she was trying to disappear into her oversized hoodie. I parked and got out, walking over slowly, unsure how to greet her. "Hey," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up, and for a second, her face crumpled. But she took a deep breath, regaining her composure, and stood up. "Thanks for coming," she whispered, wiping her eyes. I know it's late." I shrugged, trying to play it off like this was no big deal. "Yeah, well, you sounded like you needed help." We stood there awkwardly for a moment. both of us unsure of how to navigate the strange tension hanging between us. Finally, I motioned to the car and we climbed in. She was silent as I drove, staring out the window, her fingers fidgeting in her lap. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. "Emily, what happened?" She took a deep, shaky breath, as if gathering the courage to tell me. "It's my boyfriend, ex-boyfriend, I guess," she muttered bitterly. "We had a fight, and he lost it, screaming, throwing things. I had to get out of there." I felt a surge of anger at the thought of anyone treating her that way. "Did he hurt you?" She shook her head. "Not physically, no, but he scared me, Ben. I didn't feel safe." She paused, her voice trembling. I didn't know who else to call. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to track this guy down, make him regret ever laying a hand on her. But another part of me felt the old wounds reopening, and I forced myself to stay calm, to keep the conversation focused on her. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" I asked gently. She shook her head. "Not really. I just needed to get away." We drove in silence for a few minutes, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. Finally, I cleared my throat. "You can stay with me tonight, just until you figure things out." She looked over at me, her eyes wide with relief and something else, gratitude, maybe. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose." "It's fine, really," I said, hoping my voice sounded reassuring. "Just until you have a plan." She nodded, her shoulders relaxing a little, and leaned back in the seat. We didn't say much after that, both lost in our own thoughts as I drove through the quiet streets. By the time we reached my apartment, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and adrenaline, like my body couldn't decide if it was time to sleep or fight. Inside, I offered her the couch, grabbing a spare blanket from the closet and setting it up. She sat down gingerly, as if she didn't quite belong there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was some bizarre dream. "Thanks, Ben," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, unsure what else to say. "Get some rest. We'll figure things out in the morning." I retreated to my bedroom, closing the door softly behind me. But I didn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, memories flooding back. Late nights spent talking about everything and nothing, road trips, quiet mornings together. I convinced myself I'd moved on. But now, with her just a room away, I wasn't so sure. In the morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. I stumbled into the kitchen to find Emily standing at the counter, pouring 2 cups. She looked different in the daylight. Tired, yes, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes that hadn't been there the night before. "I made coffee," she said, holding out a cup. "I hope that's okay." I took it, smiling. "Yeah, of course." We sat at the small kitchen table, sipping our coffee in comfortable silence. Eventually, she looked up at me, her eyes serious. "Ben, I know this is weird, and I'm sorry for just showing up like this. I don't want to mess up your life." "You're not messing anything up," I said quickly, though I wasn't sure if that was entirely true. "Look, if you need help, I'm here." She nodded, biting her lip as if considering her next words carefully. "I've been thinking maybe I need a fresh start, away from here, away from everything." It hit me like a punch to the gut. The idea of her leaving, for good this time, stirred something in me I didn't want to face. But I knew she was right. She needed to move on, find her own path. Maybe that's for the best. I managed, though the words felt like betrayal on my tongue. She looked down at her coffee, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah, I think so." We finished our coffee in silence, both of us pretending not to notice the weight of what wasn't being said. When she finally got up to leave, I felt a pang of loss, knowing that this time, there was no coming back. At the door, she turned to face me, her eyes soft and sad. "Thank you, Ben, for everything. I'll never forget it." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Take care, Emily." And then, she was gone, the door clicking softly behind her. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the empty space where she'd been. I knew this was the right thing, the clean break we both needed. But as the silence settled around me, I realized that some part of me would always be waiting for her, hoping for one more late-night call, one more chance to be there when she needed me. But life isn't a movie. People move on, and sometimes letting them go is the best way to love them. So I closed the door, put the coffee cups in the sink, and went on with my day, carrying her memory like a quiet echo that would fade with time. When my cousin Jesse landed his dream internship, he thought he was set. It was at a prestigious company, the kind he'd dreamed of working for ever since he picked his major. He'd fought tooth and nail for the spot, going through 3 grueling interview rounds and beating out hundreds of other candidates. The email they sent even called him a valuable addition to their team. But on his second week, he realized valuable was just code for free labor. He was working 10-hour days on projects that felt like they belonged in a full-time role. When he mentioned overtime pay, his manager just chuckled and said, "This is what it means to get ahead, kid." Jesse looked at me over coffee one night, his face shadowed with exhaustion, and said, "Guess they forgot to tell me I'd be paying them in my sleep." The week Jesse told me about his internship, I had a brush with the ticket scalpers myself. I've been hyped for this small underground concert, the kind that draws in people who genuinely love the music. Tickets went on sale at noon, and by 12:01, they were gone. Not even 5 minutes later, I found those same tickets on resale sites, marked up 4 times their price. My frustration bubbled over as I stared at the screen, helpless. It was like every good thing in life was being auctioned off to whoever could pay the most. And it wasn't just tickets. You see it everywhere. Even stuff like groceries was starting to feel like a luxury. I mean, $6 for a carton of eggs? It made me wonder how we'd gotten here, where basics and little joys were slowly slipping out of reach. Later that week, Jesse and I were venting to each other on the train. He was rattling off a story about his latest unpaid project when we noticed a police dog moving down the car, stopping randomly to sniff people's bags. They pulled this young guy to the side. He looked barely 20. The officers were stern, telling him to open his backpack while the dog circled, sniffing as if it had hit the jackpot. But when the search was over, they'd found nothing, just a pair of gym clothes and a couple textbooks. They handed the bag back to him and walked off without so much as an apology. The guy was left there, red-faced, picking up his scattered belongings. "They just wanted to flex," Jesse muttered, shaking his head. Power for the sake of power. That whole interaction stuck with me. Just like Jesse's internship, where his manager held all the cards, or the ticket sites that snatched the music away from real fans. It felt like the world was turning into one big game of who's got the upper hand, and most of us were stuck on the losing side. The next night, Jesse and I met up with our friend Becca at a bar. Becca works in finance, and she was fired up about a news story on politicians using insider knowledge to trade stocks. "They're supposed to be public servants," she scoffed, swirling her drink, "but they're treating Congress like a hedge fund." She went on, explaining how some representatives had quietly offloaded stocks right before huge economic hits, moves that would have gotten anyone else arrested for insider trading. But for them, business as usual. We sat there in silence for a moment, each of us chewing on that bitter pill, the realization that the people running the show were only playing for themselves. To lighten the mood, we changed the subject to something less rage-inducing, or so we thought. Jesse pulled out his phone and started scrolling. "Guess how many companies have access to my data?" he asked, showing us his settings page. It was a shockingly long list, filled with apps that shouldn't need more than a username and password. It hit me that all these apps were probably mining every click, every GPS ping, every text message for data they could sell. "Privacy's just a suggestion at this point," he joked, but it wasn't funny. The apps we thought were harmless had turned into silent collectors, a dozen tiny spies sitting in our pockets. And then there was Becca's story about her co-worker, Dan. Apparently, he'd been going through a rough patch with gambling, and she caught a glimpse of it firsthand. "It's everywhere now," she said. "TV, billboards, even ads on my phone." She told us how Dan had admitted he'd blown most of his savings on online gambling, egged on by flashy ads promising quick cash. It was scary to think about how easy it was for him to get sucked in. "The same people who used to make cigarette ads are pushing gambling now," she said, shaking her head. "They banned smoking ads for public health. But gambling? They're all for it." By the end of the night, we were exhausted, not just from the drinks, but from all the weight we were carrying, the realization that everything felt upside down. Jesse finished his drink and looked at us, a sad smile on his face. "Feels like everything's a trap, you know? The tickets, the data, the internships, the whole deal. It's like they set us up just to knock us down. None of us could argue. The email came late at night, just as I was about to log off my laptop and call it a day. My inbox was full of the usual junk, mostly promotional offers I kept meaning to unsubscribe from. But right at the top, glowing with that fresh, unread marker, was an email with a subject line that made my stomach twist. Time Capsule Project. My hands froze over the keyboard. I hadn't thought about the time capsule in years. It was a project from my last year of high school, something my senior class had put together. The whole school had been buzzing with excitement, talking about what to include, what messages to leave behind for our future selves. We each wrote letters and threw in a few objects, small, random things that felt important at the time. Then, we buried the capsule in a patch of land behind the school with the promise that it would be unearthed 20 years later. I clicked on the email, feeling a mix of nostalgia and dread. It was from our old class president, Monica Patel, who'd somehow become the unofficial organizer of everything related to our high school. The email was short and to the point. Hey, class of '03, we're opening the time capsule on Saturday at 3 p.m. Can you believe it's been 20 years? Hope to see you all there. Best, Monica. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. 20 years. It felt like a lifetime and no time at all. So much had changed. And yet a part of me felt like I was still that awkward 18-year-old, uncertain and restless. I closed my laptop and leaned back, wondering if I really wanted to go. Revisiting high school memories wasn't exactly on my bucket list, but something about the idea of that capsule, of messages and mementos from a version of myself I barely remembered, drew me in. Saturday rolled around faster than I expected. I almost backed out a dozen times, but forced myself to go. If nothing else, it would be a chance to see some old friends, maybe laugh about how clueless we all were back then. The school looked smaller than I remembered, worn and a little run down. I parked and walked toward the back, where a small crowd had gathered, people I hadn't seen in 2 decades. There were a lot of familiar faces. Monica, looking exactly the same, somehow. Josh, who'd been on the soccer team and now sported a bald head. Lisa, who used to be my best friend but whom I hadn't spoken to in years. We exchanged polite greetings, the typical awkward small talk that always comes with reunions. I felt both out of place and strangely at home, surrounded by these people who had been part of my life in ways no one else could understand. Monica called for everyone's attention, holding a shovel and grinning like she'd just won the lottery. All right, guys, are we ready to unearth the past? A few cheers went up, though most people just looked amused, as if we were all wondering what we'd been thinking back then. I shifted from foot to foot, nervous energy buzzing through me as Monica and Josh started digging. After a few minutes, they hit something solid, and Monica's eyes lit up. Here it is, she announced, brushing away dirt to reveal a large metal box, rusted and worn but still intact. She and Josh lifted it out, setting it on a table they'd brought along. Monica fumbled with the latch, and then, with a dramatic flourish, threw open the lid. Inside, the contents were a chaotic mix of items. Notes, photographs, little trinkets. We all crowded around, craning our necks to see. One by one, Monica started pulling things out, reading off names and passing the items to their original owners. There were laughs, gasps, even a few tears. People held up photos of themselves as teenagers, marveled at the silly things they'd left behind. A Pokemon card, a broken watch, a cassette tape of a mix someone had made. Then Monica pulled out a stack of folded letters, each one labeled with a name. I held my breath as she sorted through them, finally calling out, "Ben Morrison!" I stepped forward, feeling a strange surge of anxiety as she handed me the letter. It was sealed, my name scrawled across the front in my own messy handwriting. I took it gingerly, half afraid of what I'd find inside. As I unfolded the letter, I caught a whiff of something faint and familiar, probably the smell of the old notebook paper I used back then. I read the first line, and a wave of memories crashed over me. Dear future me, I hope you're not still scared of everything. I laughed, a short, nervous laugh that drew a few glances. I read on, my 17-year-old self spilling out fears and dreams I'd forgotten I ever had. I hope you finally figured out what you want to do. And if you're still wondering, just remember, don't settle. Don't do something just because it's easy. Life's too short for that, right? I swallowed hard, feeling a strange tightness in my chest. I'd spent so much of my life taking the safe route, doing what was expected, never really daring to take the risks I'd once dreamed about. Part of me had given up on the idea of finding purpose or passion a long time ago. I'd buried those dreams just as we buried this capsule. But my younger self hadn't known that. He'd been full of optimism, ready to take on the world. I read the final lines scrawled in a shaky hand. Just promise me you won't lose yourself. No matter what happens, don't forget who you wanted to be. I looked up, blinking back tears. Around me, other people were reading their own letters, some laughing, some looking contemplative. Lisa, my old best friend, was standing nearby, clutching her letter and staring into the distance. "Hey, Lisa," I said, my voice softer than I intended. She looked over, surprised, and then gave me a small smile. "Ben, it's been a while." "Yeah, too long," I replied, realizing how much I'd missed her. We talked for a few minutes, catching up in a way that felt natural, like no time had passed at all. She told me about her life, her job, her kids, and I shared my own updates, though they felt less significant now. As we talked, I felt a warmth I hadn't felt in years, like reconnecting with an old part of myself. Before long, people began trickling away, saying their goodbyes and promising to keep in touch. I stayed for a few more minutes, staring at the letter in my hand, feeling the weight of those words. I couldn't help but wonder, had I kept that promise? Had I stayed true to who I wanted to be? As I walked back to my car, I made a decision. I didn't know exactly what it would mean yet, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to keep living on autopilot. That letter was a reminder, a little push from my younger self, telling me to wake up, to stop coasting. Back in the car, I looked at the letter one more time, my heart pounding with a strange sense of urgency. Then I slipped it into the glove compartment, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Life had given me a second chance, and this time I wasn't going to let it slip away. This happened only a few months ago, and I still haven't told anyone about it. I can barely sleep, and when I do, I wake up in a cold sweat, sometimes screaming. I can't get the images out of my head, the way everything seemed so normal right until it wasn't. I've been working for a moving company for about 6 months, hauling furniture, packing boxes, basic stuff. We mostly worked in residential neighborhoods, occasionally a corporate office or two. But one evening, my manager, Don, came to me with a weird request. He asked if I'd be willing to do a late-night job solo. It was a last-minute request from a big client, and he promised I'd get a generous bonus if I went. I'd been behind on rent, so I said yes without a second thought. The address was in the next city over, and I was supposed to pick up some items from a storage facility and deliver them to a house about 20 miles away. I arrived at the storage facility around 11 p.m., and the place was deserted. There were long rows of identical units, their metal doors lined up like some weird, industrial graveyard. It was dead silent except for the distant hum of highway traffic. When I found the unit listed on the order, I realized the client had left it unlocked. That was strange, but I figured they'd just been in a rush. I lifted the door and hit the light switch. Inside, it was packed with old furniture. Everything was wrapped in thick, dusty sheets. But that wasn't the weirdest part. In the center of the room, there was a large wooden crate, nailed shut, with a laminated paper taped to the top. The paper had one word written on it in thick black marker: deliver. I had no idea what was inside, but it was big and heavy, maybe an antique or some kind of expensive equipment. I'd been hired to deliver it, so I shrugged and got to work. I loaded everything carefully, securing the crate to the truck with thick straps, making sure it wouldn't budge during the drive. As I was about to close up the truck, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Make sure the crate stays upright. Do not open it." That's when I started to feel a bit uneasy. I'd had plenty of clients who were protective of their belongings, but there was something unsettling about the message. I replied, asking if there were any other special instructions, but got no response. Figuring there wasn't much else I could do, I finished securing the load, got into the truck, and started the drive. About 10 minutes in, I noticed a strange smell, a metallic, slightly sweet scent that seemed to be coming from the crate. I turned on the air conditioning, hoping it would dissipate, but the smell only grew stronger, like a mix of copper and something rotting. I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just from the dust or something. But then I heard a sound, a faint rhythmic thumping like something shifting in the back of the truck. I pulled over, trying to calm myself down. It's an old piece of furniture, I told myself. Probably just settling or shifting slightly. I checked the crate, tightened the straps, and got back on the road. But not 5 minutes later, the thumping returned, louder this time, more insistent. It sounded like something was moving around, trying to push its way out. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, and I could feel my pulse hammering. I was alone, on a dark stretch of road, hauling a crate with something inside it. I picked up my phone to call Dawn, but there was no signal. I was completely alone. Then, without warning, the crate shifted so hard that the truck swayed. I nearly lost control, pulling off to the side of the road just in time. I climbed into the back of the truck, heart pounding, staring at the crate. I didn't want to open it. Everything in me was screaming not to. But I needed to know what was inside. Needed to know what I was transporting at midnight on an empty road. As I moved closer, I heard it, a whisper, faint and muffled, coming from inside the crate. I froze, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard it again, louder this time. It was unmistakable, a voice, pleading, saying something I couldn't quite make out. My hands shook as I grabbed a crowbar from the truck's toolkit. I knew I shouldn't open it. The text had warned me. But curiosity and fear mixed into something I couldn't resist. I wedged the crowbar into the edge of the crate and pried it open. The smell hit me first, a sickly, overwhelming stench that made me gag. And then, as I lifted the lid, I saw what was inside. It was a man, bound, gagged, bruised. His eyes met mine, wide and frantic, pleading. He tried to scream through the gag, thrashing against the ropes that held him down. I stumbled back, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. There was no way this could be real. I backed away, almost falling out of the truck, scrambling to my feet as I tried to think. My phone still had no signal. I looked around, hoping to see headlights in the distance, but the road was empty. The man in the crate kept thrashing, banging against the wood, his muffled screams growing louder. I thought about just driving him to the nearest police station, but something about the whole situation felt horribly wrong. I wasn't supposed to open the crate. Someone had left him there, wanted him to be delivered somewhere. For a split second, I thought about closing the lid, pretending I'd never seen him. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't just leave him there. I jumped back into the truck, fumbling with my phone, desperate for a signal. I started driving, thinking maybe I could find somewhere with reception. But as I sped down the road, my phone buzzed. Another message from the same unknown number. We told you not to open it. A chill ran down my spine. Whoever had sent that message was watching me. Somehow, I floored it, speeding toward the closest town, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me. But the road was still empty. Then my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a video. Hands shaking, I opened it. The video was taken from what looked like a security camera feed, aimed right at me as I was opening the crate. It showed me lifting the lid, my horrified expression as I saw the man inside. And then at the end, there was a message typed over the screen. Turn back now, or you'll both regret it. I was almost to the town when I saw them. Headlights behind me, 2 black SUVs gaining on me fast. My heart was racing, and I knew they were coming for the crate, coming for him. I didn't know what to do. If I stopped, they'd take him. If I kept going, who knew what they'd do to us? Then the SUVs sped up, pulling up on either side of the truck, boxing me in. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop on the shoulder. The SUVs stopped too, and a group of men in dark suits got out, walking toward me with calm, unhurried steps. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head, approached my window. He knocked once, and I rolled it down just enough to hear him. His voice was smooth, chillingly calm. You shouldn't have opened it, he said like he was scolding a child. Step out of the truck. I was paralyzed with fear, but I managed to shake my head. I can't. There's a man in there. He held up a hand to silence me. This isn't your concern. Step out, and you can walk away. I glanced back at the crate, hearing the faint sounds of the man's muffled screams, his frantic movements. I didn't want to leave him, but as I looked into the stranger's cold, unblinking eyes, I knew I didn't have a choice. I slowly opened the door and stepped out, feeling my legs shaking beneath me. The men moved past me without a word, opening the back of the truck. I couldn't bear to watch, but I couldn't look away. They closed the crate, securing it as if it were just another piece of cargo. Within minutes, they were gone, driving off with the man still trapped inside, leaving me standing alone on the side of the road. I didn't go back to work after that night. I didn't tell anyone what happened. But sometimes in the middle of the night, I get a message from that same unknown number. It's always the same words. We told you not to open it. I'm an ER nurse, 15 years on the job, and I've seen just about everything you can imagine. People who come in so far gone you wonder how they're still breathing. People who fight tooth and nail over stupid things, then show up covered in cuts, bruises, or worse. Most nights I can handle it, go home, let it roll off me. But a couple of months ago, something happened that's been living in the back of my mind, creeping in every time I close my eyes. I've tried to move past it, but some things just stick. It was late, maybe around 3 a.m., and we'd had a string of difficult cases all night. The whole department was tense, people running on caffeine and adrenaline, with no room to breathe between patients. Just as I started to think things were slowing down, we got a call about a young man, 20s, unconscious and brought in by a friend. The guy didn't say much, just handed him over and left without even giving his name. Right away, that struck me as odd. People don't usually just dump someone in the ER and vanish, but you learn not to ask too many questions. The patient was pale, breathing shallow, with marks around his wrists and neck that looked like bruises. My first thought was that he'd been in some kind of accident or fight. I tried to check his vitals, but he barely reacted, eyes half closed, mumbling something I couldn't make out. I got him hooked up to the monitors and called for one of the docs to take a look. By the time they arrived, his pulse was erratic and his oxygen levels were dipping. He was slipping fast, and none of us could figure out why. As we worked, I caught a glimpse of his arms and noticed dozens of tiny cuts, barely healed and crisscrossing all over his skin. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either, like he'd been cutting himself, maybe out of desperation, maybe something else. I tried to talk to him, asking if he could tell me what happened, but his eyes wouldn't focus. He just kept whispering, repeating something under his breath, too soft for me to hear. We stabilized him enough to move him to one of the exam rooms. I was with him alone for a few minutes, adjusting his four, when he suddenly reached out and grabbed my wrist. I froze. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone in his state. His eyes were wide, terrified, like he was trying to tell me something crucial. His voice was barely a whisper, but I'll never forget what he said. They're still watching. Don't let them find me. A chill ran down my spine, and I had to force myself to stay calm. I've dealt with psych patients, people in the middle of full-blown delusions, but his fear was different. It wasn't the babbling of someone out of touch with reality. He seemed completely aware, as if he genuinely believed there was someone or something after him. I tried to reassure him, telling him he was safe in the hospital, that no one could hurt him here. But he just shook his head, eyes fixed on something just past my shoulder. He looked as if he were staring straight through me. The doctors eventually decided he needed to be sedated. His vitals were all over the place, and we couldn't risk him going into cardiac arrest. We sedated him, and his breathing finally stabilized, but that haunted expression stayed with me, even as his eyes drifted shut. It was like he was caught in some kind of nightmare he couldn't wake up from. A few hours later, I went to check on him again, but his room was empty. I asked around, thinking maybe they'd moved him to another floor, but none of the other nurses had seen him. Security was called, and they checked the cameras. What we saw didn't make any sense. The footage showed him walking out of his room, pulling out his IVs, slipping past the front desk, and vanishing into the night like he was never there. Just gone into thin air. I kept replaying that moment in my head, wondering how he'd had the strength to walk out after the state he'd been in. I'd seen patients disappear before, but not like that. This felt different, unsettling. I didn't expect to hear anything about him after that, but a couple of days later, I got a call from the police. They'd found a body near the river, matching his description. Cause of death was listed as drowning, but there were no clear details on what happened. It didn't make sense. The river was miles from the hospital, and he'd been so weak when I last saw him. The thought of him wandering through the city, alone, desperate, terrified, kept me up at night. I wondered if he'd really been running from someone, if there was some truth behind the fear I'd seen in his eyes. I tried to forget, to move on, but about a month after that, I was on another late shift when they brought in a young woman, same age, same bruises, same cuts on her arms. She was unconscious, brought in by someone who didn't stick around long enough to leave a name. As we got her stabilized, she started mumbling, too, words barely audible, but just clear enough that I could make out a few. They're watching. They're always watching. I don't believe in coincidences, not in this line of work. I've seen too much, heard too many stories, to think that these things just happen randomly. It left a bad taste in my mouth, and I felt this heavy, creeping feeling like there was something going on I couldn't see, something right under the surface that I'd never understand. That young woman survived, but I can still remember the way she looked at me when she finally woke up. It was that same terrified look, that same haunted stare that the young man had had. She didn't say anything after that, wouldn't answer questions, just lay there, silent, eyes darting to every shadow in the room. Eventually, she was discharged, and like the man before her, she disappeared, no follow-up, no contact. I don't know what to make of it. Maybe it was all in their heads, a shared delusion, a trauma they couldn't escape. Or maybe there's something out there, something we don't see, something that leaves marks no medical treatment can heal. Whatever it was, it stayed with me. I still find myself glancing over my shoulder on the walk to my car, half expecting to see someone watching from the shadows, waiting. Because that's the thing about fear. It sticks long after the people who brought it to you are gone. When I first moved into the apartment, it felt like a fresh start. New city, new job, and a tiny but affordable one-bedroom on the outskirts of downtown. It wasn't anything fancy, just a worn little place on the top floor of an older building, but it was mine, and that was enough. The layout was cramped, and the walls were thin, but I'd take it. After all, I was living alone for the first time in my life. The trouble started a few weeks after I moved in, though it took a while for me to realize it was anything beyond my imagination. I'd come home from work and notice small things out of place. My toothbrush wasn't where I left it, or the light in the kitchen was on when I was certain I'd turned it off. Just little things. I figured I was just tired, distracted by all the newness. Maybe I was losing my mind a bit, but that felt almost comforting in a weird way. A stressful job, a new place, that kind of messes with your head, right? But then things started happening that I couldn't ignore. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of soft scratching coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. It was a slow, repetitive scrape, like someone lightly dragging their nails along the wall. I lay there, frozen, listening. It didn't stop. It just kept going, a rhythmic scratching that felt like it was counting down to something. I held my breath, praying it was just a neighbor, a rat, anything but what my mind was imagining. After a few minutes, it faded away, leaving me in a thick, suffocating silence. The next morning, I tried to brush it off as a nightmare. Maybe it was just the building settling or a stray cat outside. I convinced myself I was overreacting, that there was a logical explanation. But the feeling of unease stayed with me all day, hanging over me like a dark cloud I couldn't shake. The scratching came back the next night, and the night after that. Every night, around the same time, that slow, persistent scrape. I never opened my bedroom door to check. I couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I lay in bed, heart pounding, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, willing it to stop. And every night, after a few minutes, it would. About a week later, I came home to find something written on my bathroom mirror. It was just a single word, traced in what looked like condensation, though I hadn't used a shower that morning. Come. That was it. Just that one word. I stared at it, trying to make sense of it, feeling my skin go cold. Maybe it was some kind of prank. Maybe I'd missed it the night before. But the fear gnawed at me, like something crawling, just beneath my skin. I scrubbed the mirror clean and told myself it was nothing. Just a smudge, maybe a fluke. But that night, the scratching outside my bedroom door was louder, more insistent, like whoever or whatever was on the other side was desperate to get in. I lay there, paralyzed, clutching my phone, the word from the mirror repeating in my mind, "Come." I was starting to lose sleep, and every small sound set me on edge. During the day, I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. A dark shape slipping around the corner, a shadow darting across the room. And every night, the scratching grew louder, more frantic, as though it was trying to wear me down, piece by piece, until I cracked. Then one night, I heard something different. It was late, past 3, and I was lying awake, bracing myself for the scratching. But this time, there was a soft creak, like the sound of a door opening. My blood ran cold as I realized it was coming from my front door. I hadn't heard any footsteps, but I could feel someone standing in my living room, that silent weight of a presence just beyond the bedroom wall. I lay still, barely daring to breathe, listening. And then, in the quiet, I heard a soft, raspy whisper. "Come out." It was barely audible, more of a hiss than a voice, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I squeezed my eyes shut, my mind racing, and waited for it to pass. But the whisper came again, a little louder this time, like it was right outside my bedroom door. "Come out." I don't remember falling asleep that night. I think I just lay there, clutching the blankets, waiting for the dawn to break. When the first light of morning finally crept through the window, I got up, packed a bag, and drove to my sister's house without looking back. I told her I needed to crash for a few nights, said it was for work, but she could tell something was wrong. She didn't push, though, and for a few days, things were better. I slept through the night, didn't hear any scratching or whispers. For a moment, I even thought I was free of it. But 2 days later, when I went back to pick up some more clothes, something was off. As soon as I opened the door, I felt it, a shift in the air, a heavy stillness that felt like stepping into someone else's nightmare. I forced myself to go inside, feeling that same, suffocating dread crawl up my spine. I walked down the hallway to my bedroom, and that's when I saw it. On the walls, written in something dark and thick, were words scrawled messily, like someone had written them in a frenzy. "Come out, come out, come out." The words covered the entire wall, overlapping each other, written over and over, filling every inch of space. They trailed down the hallway, into the bathroom, over the mirror, on the floor, everywhere. It was like someone had taken every ounce of rage, every ounce of whatever haunted that place, and poured it out in writing. I backed away, heart hammering, barely able to breathe. When I heard it again, that voice, right behind me, close enough that I felt the breath on my neck. "Come out," it whispered, soft and mocking, like it knew I had nowhere else to go. I ran out of that apartment, barely remembering to lock the door behind me. I haven't gone back since. I paid my landlord to move my things out, told him I had to leave for work, that I'd pay extra if he didn't ask questions. He didn't, but I could see the suspicion in his eyes, like he already knew something was wrong with that place. It's been weeks now, and I'm living with my sister, still too afraid to sleep alone. I don't talk about what happened. Part of me wants to believe it's over, that whatever was in that apartment is still there, festering in the dark, waiting for the next unlucky soul. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear something in the walls, a faint scratching, or a soft whisper in the corner of the room, telling me to come out. And I can't shake the feeling that, sooner or later, it'll find me again. It started on a warm summer evening. We were at a wedding, one of those romantic fairy tale celebrations that makes everyone feel just a little more in love. He looked incredible in his suit, and he held my hand through the vows, squeezed it at the idos, even gave me a quick kiss on the forehead during the reception. I remember thinking how lucky I was, how completely in sync we seemed. The first pang of suspicion hit me as we were dancing. I saw him glance across the room and lock eyes with someone, a woman with long, dark hair and a bright, open smile. They exchanged a look that I couldn't quite place. It was quick, subtle, but there was a familiarity in it that didn't sit right with me. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But the feeling lingered. That night, he seemed distracted, a little too eager to refill our drinks, to go off and chat with people on his own. Every now and then, I'd catch him glancing across the room, his gaze flicking back to me whenever he thought I noticed. I tried to shake off the unease, laughing and dancing, telling myself it was all in my head. But once that seed of doubt is planted, it grows. A few weeks later, we were at home watching a movie when his phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his face changed, just for a second. But I saw it. A tiny, barely there smile. I asked who it was, trying to sound casual, and he shrugged it off. "Just work," he said, turning the phone face down on the coffee table. It was such a small moment, but it stuck with me, nagging at me in the quiet hours of the night when I'd lie awake, wondering if I was imagining things. The changes in him came gradually, like small, almost imperceptible shifts. He started going out more, just to clear his head, he'd say, or to grab a quick drink with friends. He'd come home late, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his usual. Once, I found a smudge of lipstick on his shirt collar, a shade far darker than anything I owned. When I pointed it out, he laughed it off, claiming it must have been from a hug at a work event. But the excuses were starting to pile up, each one thinly veiled, barely holding together. One evening, I was looking for a jacket in the closet when I noticed a faint smell on one of his scarves. Perfume, sweet and unfamiliar. I held the fabric in my hand, breathing it in, and a feeling of dread settled over me. My mind raced with every possibility, each one worse than the last. I debated confronting him right then, but something held me back. I wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that this was just my imagination, that I was reading too much into everything. Then came the night he didn't come home at all. He told me he was working late, that he'd be back by 10. 10 came and went. Midnight ticked by. By 2 in the morning, I was sitting on the couch, every nerve in my body alive with worry and anger and heartbreak. I called him, but it went straight to voicemail. I texted, no reply. I must have sat there for hours, staring at the door, waiting for him to come home with some story, some excuse, anything. At 6 in the morning, he walked in, looking disheveled and exhausted. His shirt was wrinkled, and there was a shadow in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. I asked him where he'd been, my voice barely above a whisper, and he hesitated. For a moment, I saw the truth in his face before he hid it behind a wall of lies. He told me he'd had to stay with a friend, that he hadn't wanted to wake me by coming home so late. It was a flimsy story, one that fell apart the moment he said it. But he stuck to it, even as I stared at him, waiting for the real explanation. He gave none. After that, the signs became harder to ignore. He was always on his phone, stepping out of the room to take calls, turning the screen away when I sat beside him. He was distant, pulling away whenever I tried to reach out, his warmth replaced by a coldness I couldn't break through. Every attempt I made to talk about it ended in an argument, with him accusing me of being paranoid, of overthinking. He'd raise his voice, frustrated, telling me I was imagining things and that he didn't have time for my insecurities. I felt myself shrinking, doubting my own instincts, wondering if maybe he was right, if maybe I was the one tearing us apart. But deep down I knew. I knew in the way he'd stopped meeting my eyes, in the hollow excuses, in the sudden absence of affection. I knew, even as I tried to deny it, clinging to the hope that maybe I was wrong. The truth came out a month later, not from him, but from a mutual friend. We were at a party when she pulled me aside, looking uneasy, as if she'd been carrying a heavy secret. She told me she'd seen him with someone else, a woman with long dark hair, the same one from the wedding. They'd been together at a bar across town, looking far too comfortable, too familiar. She tried to convince herself it wasn't what it looked like, but she'd seen the way he touched the woman's arm, the way they'd leaned in close, laughing, heads nearly touching. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I thanked her, barely able to process the words, and left the party in a daze. That night, I waited for him to come home, my mind racing with everything I wanted to say, every hurt and betrayal simmering beneath the surface. When he walked through the door, I confronted him, my voice breaking as I asked him if he loved her. For the first time, he didn't try to deny it. He just stood there, staring at the floor, his silence louder than any excuse he could have offered. He admitted that he'd met her months ago, that it had just happened, that he hadn't meant for things to go this far. His words were hollow, a pathetic attempt at explanation that only deepened the wound. I told him to leave that night. Watching him pack his things was surreal, like watching a stranger erase himself from my life. I thought I'd feel relief, but all I felt was emptiness, a vast ache where my trust, my love, had once been. He left, closing the door softly, as if he could undo the damage by leaving quietly. In the days that followed, I felt like a ghost, moving through my own life with a numbness that clung to me like a fog. Friends tried to comfort me, but the words felt distant, hollow, unable to reach the depths of my pain. I deleted his messages, erased his photos, purged every trace of him from my life, but the memories lingered, each one a cruel reminder of the man I thought I knew. Slowly, painfully, I rebuilt myself. I learned to trust my own instincts again, to believe in my worth, to find strength in the scars he left behind. And though the wound still aches from time to time, I know that I've come out stronger, that I am no longer the woman who ignored the signs, who doubted herself in the face of lies. I am someone new, someone whole, and that I know is the real victory. It's strange how love can blind you, dull your instincts, and turn red flags into fairy lights. With him, I never thought to question anything. We'd met at a friend's New Year's Eve party, and from that moment, we were inseparable. He was charming, attentive, the type who'd remember the tiniest details, like the way I took my coffee or my favorite song when I had a rough day. Being with him felt effortless, like slipping into a favorite sweater. I was convinced we were perfect. The first hint of trouble came in the form of a new friend he'd met at work. I'll call her Sarah. He spoke about her casually at first, mentioning her in passing. "Oh, Sarah thought that was hilarious," he'd say, or "Sarah recommended this movie." I didn't think much of it. I'd always been confident, never the jealous type. But over time, her name started popping up in conversations more frequently, and with it, this gnawing feeling in my gut. One night, I found him sitting on the couch, phone in hand, texting and chuckling. "Who are you texting?" I asked, half joking, half curious. He looked up, surprised, almost as if he'd forgotten I was there. "Oh, just Sarah," he said, his tone light. "She had this funny story about her dog." I forced a smile, pushing down the weird pang I felt at the casual way he said her name, like she was a staple in his life. He'd never had female friends before, at least not ones he texted late at night. But I shook it off, telling myself I was overreacting. Then came the Friday nights. He'd always been home for our pizza and movie tradition, but one evening, he told me he'd made plans with Sarah and some coworkers. "Just a team hangout," he said. "I'll be back by 10. 10 turned into midnight, and midnight turned into a vague apology text saying he'd crashed on a friend's couch. When he finally came home the next morning, he was quiet, his eyes slightly bloodshot, offering excuses that felt flimsy even as he said them. My heart twisted, but I didn't push him. I wanted to believe in the man I'd fallen for, to trust that this was a one-time thing. But things only got stranger. His phone, once an open book, was now guarded with a password I didn't know. He'd angle the screen away whenever he'd get a text, which was happening more often. He'd go for walks when he was on the phone, telling me it was just to clear his head. Our conversations grew strained, punctuated by long silences. The inside jokes we once shared were replaced by surface-level exchanges, a sense of distance settling between us like an invisible wall. Then came the night of our anniversary. I'd planned a small celebration at home, just the two of us, something cozy and intimate. I'd cooked his favorite meal, lit candles, set the table with the nice plates we rarely used. He texted me around 6 p.m., saying he'd be a bit late due to a last-minute meeting. Hours passed, and with each minute, my heart sank further. The candles burned down, the food grew cold, and the hope that he'd walk through the door faded. When he finally came home, close to midnight, he smelled faintly of wine and perfume. I tried to confront him, but he brushed me off, apologizing vaguely and blaming work stress. "We can celebrate tomorrow," he said, as if our anniversary was just another item on a to-do list. Something snapped inside me. I needed to know, to hear the truth no matter how much it hurt. That night, I lay awake, the silence of the apartment thick and suffocating, wondering if I'd been lying to myself all along. The next day, while he was in the shower, I reached for his phone on the nightstand. My hands shook as I scrolled through his messages, searching for any mention of Sarah. And there it was, a trail of conversations, filled with inside jokes, late-night confessions, little exchanges that had once been ours. I saw messages with her name followed by winking emojis, words that felt intimate and familiar, like they were meant for a partner, not a friend. My stomach twisted as I read, each word stabbing a little deeper, unraveling the fabric of our life together. He came out of the shower, finding me standing there with his phone in my hand. His face went pale, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken words. He started to stammer, to explain, but the truth hung between us, undeniable. I asked him if he loved her, if he even remembered what we had. He couldn't look me in the eye. In the days that followed, we had countless painful conversations, attempts at explanations, at understanding. He told me it had just happened, that it wasn't serious, that it didn't mean anything. But the betrayal was too raw, too deep to be patched up with excuses. I couldn't forget the moments he'd chosen her over me, the times he'd lied to my face, the way he'd stolen our time and given it to someone else. Every memory we shared felt tainted, overshadowed by the secret he'd kept. I packed my things slowly, almost mechanically, numb to the pain that waited just under the surface. He begged me to stay, promised he'd change, that he'd end it with her. But I couldn't go back, couldn't pretend that everything was fine, not after seeing the truth. Leaving felt like ripping out a piece of my soul, but staying would have been a slow death of everything I believed in. In the months that followed, I learned how to be alone again. I rediscovered pieces of myself I'd forgotten, slowly finding joy in small things, in moments that were mine and mine alone. I cut my hair, painted my walls a new color, threw myself into my work and hobbies, rebuilding a life that no longer included him. And as the pain dulled, I found strength in knowing I'd survived, that I'd walked away from something that no longer served me, no matter how much it once meant. There are still days when the memory stings, but I know now that I deserve a love that's whole, that doesn't come with conditions or half-truths. And if I've learned anything, it's that sometimes the hardest thing is also the right thing. Walking away hurt, but it was the first step towards something real, something true, something that one day I'll build for myself again. My buddy Chris had been saving up for months to buy a ticket to the Formula One Grand Prix. He's obsessed, the kind of guy who follows every race, knows all the driver stats, and has more F1 merch than actual clothes. So when tickets went on sale, he was ready, credit card in hand, refreshing the page like his life depended on it. But when the page finally loaded, every single ticket was sold out. A few hours later, those same tickets started popping up on resale sites for 5 times the original price. The disappointment on his face was almost too much to look at. "I can't believe they let people do this," he muttered, staring at the screen. "This isn't for fans anymore. It's for people who can drop a fortune just to flex." Chris's frustration seemed to echo everywhere I looked. I'd just gone through a ridiculous number of interviews myself, 4 rounds and a project assignment for a job that promised unlimited growth opportunities. By the end of it, I'd basically mapped out a 5-year plan for them. But after weeks of radio silence, they ghosted me. No email, no call, just nothing. When I finally reached out to the recruiter, she apologized and said they decided to go in a different direction. All I could think was, you put me through a whole circus and then don't even have the decency to tell me straight? It was like the job market had turned into this twisted game of show and tell, except they just wanted to see how much you dance before they pulled the plug. One evening, Chris and I were venting over drinks when a news alert popped up on his phone about yet another insider trading scandal involving Congress. He rolled his eyes and showed me the headline. Apparently, a group of politicians had sold off stock in a major company right before its value tanked, based on information only they had access to. "Why am I even surprised?" Chris muttered. If you or I did this, we'd be in prison. But for them, just another Tuesday. He was right. It felt like there was this invisible wall between them and us. The rules just didn't seem to apply to the people in power. The next day, I caught up with my friend Anna, who works for a big tech company. She'd been on edge for weeks, and now I knew why. Her team was in charge of analyzing user data, and she had started to see the darker side of things. It's insane, she told me. We're tracking way more than anyone realizes. Every click, every search, even where you pause in a video, it's all fair game. She looked down, almost ashamed. And we're selling that data to whoever's paying, no questions asked. The realization hit me hard. I'd always known our data wasn't exactly private, but hearing it from someone on the inside made it feel so much more invasive, like we'd willingly given up our lives to be dissected for profit. As if that wasn't enough to make me feel disillusioned, I'd had my own brush with public safety theater that week. While grabbing lunch at a food court downtown, a group of police officers came in with a drug-sniffing dog. They started making rounds, weaving in and out of tables as people nervously watched, shifting bags closer, adjusting coats. When the dog stopped near a guy at the next table, the officers immediately jumped on him, ordering him to open his bag. They rifled through his things, turning out pockets and pouches in front of everyone, like we were supposed to be impressed by this law and order display. When they didn't find anything, they just walked off, leaving the poor guy to pick up his stuff under the watchful eyes of a dozen strangers. It was all a show, a flex that made us feel small and powerless. Just another reminder that we were all suspects until proven innocent. Later that night, I met up with my cousin Zoe, who'd recently gotten into online poker. She joked about her new hobby, but I could tell there was a darker undertone. She'd been sucked in by those ads you see everywhere. The ones that make gambling look like a harmless, exciting pastime. But the reality was far from it. They make it look so fun, you know, she said, shaking her head. But once you start, it's like they have their hooks in you. She confessed she'd already lost more than she'd planned and had to delete the app to stop herself from going back. It made me think of how they used to advertise cigarettes, making it seem cool and edgy until they realized it was killing people. But here we were, seeing gambling ads everywhere. No warnings, no regulations, as if it was no big deal. As we walked home that night, Zoe sighed, saying, "Everything just feels like a trap, doesn't it? The tickets, the jobs, the data, even the stuff that's supposed to be fun." She wasn't wrong. When I was 15, my dad decided it was finally time to take me camping out by Mount St. Helens. It was a rite of passage in our family. Every son spent a weekend alone with their father in the wilderness, fishing, hiking, listening to stories about the old days. My older brothers had gone before me, coming back with tales of trout they'd caught, trails they'd explored. I'd been looking forward to it for years. We drove out early on a Friday morning, taking the long, winding roads that cut through dense forests, passing signs warning about bear sightings and road closures. It was peaceful at first, that deep green stillness you only find far from the city. When we finally arrived, we set up camp near a small lake, surrounded by towering pine trees that stretched so high it seemed like they were holding up the sky. It felt like we were the only people on Earth. The first day was just as I'd imagined it. Fishing by the lake, swapping stories by the fire as the sun dipped behind the trees, stars beginning to scatter across the night sky. It wasn't until late into that first night, long after we'd crawled into our sleeping bags, that something strange happened. I'd woken up, disoriented, not sure why I was awake. My dad was snoring softly beside me, the tent zipped tight, the fire outside only faintly glowing embers now. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest, the gentle rustle of leaves, the occasional owl hoot, a distant frog croaking from the lake. Then just outside the tent, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crushing twigs and leaves underfoot. My heart skipped. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or some small animal passing by. But these weren't light, skittering steps. They were heavy, too calculated, circling our tent in a way that felt purposeful. The kind of footsteps that suggest the thing walking knows you're there and wants you to know it too. I reached out, shaking my dad awake, whispering frantically, "Dad, there's something outside." He was groggy, But he sat up, listening, his face growing tense as he heard the sound too. We stayed silent, the air in the tent thick with fear as we waited, the footsteps pausing just beside us. My dad gestured for me to stay quiet, grabbing the flashlight and unzipping the tent slowly. He stepped out into the darkness, shining the light around, looking for any sign of movement. I sat there, barely breathing, feeling exposed even in the tent, every nerve on edge. After a few tense moments, he came back in, his face pale. "Couldn't see anything," he whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. He tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just an animal, but his eyes didn't meet mine as he spoke. We lay there for hours, neither of us sleeping, listening to the silence that had fallen outside. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off, the footsteps echoing in my mind. The next morning, as we were cooking breakfast over the campfire, I noticed something strange just beyond our campsite. A tree near the edge of the clearing, one of the older ones with bark so thick you could almost knock on it, had deep scratches running down its trunk. They were fresh, splinters of wood scattered at its base. My dad noticed it too, his brow furrowing as he traced a hand over the marks, his fingers following the jagged grooves. "What do you think made those?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but feeling a chill creep up my spine. He didn't answer right away, just kept staring at the tree, his face unreadable. Finally, he muttered, "Must be a bear," but his tone said otherwise. We packed up earlier than planned, both of us a little on edge, the joy of the trip dampened by an unspoken tension. My dad kept glancing over his shoulder, scanning the trees as if he expected to see something hiding in the shadows. We hiked around the lake, following the narrow trail that led to a lookout point we'd wanted to visit. The air was thick with that earthy smell of pine and moss. Everything still and eerily quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As we reached the lookout, I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, like someone was watching us. I turned, glancing back down the trail, and there it was, a shape. It was half hidden among the trees, a massive, hunched figure standing motionless, watching us with an intensity that seemed to cut through the air between us. It wasn't a bear. It was too tall, too humanoid, its limbs long and twisted, its eyes shadowed under the canopy. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but he'd already seen it. He was gripping my shoulder, pulling me close, whispering that we needed to go, to move slowly, not to run. I could feel his hand trembling as he spoke, his voice tight with fear. We backed away, step by careful step, keeping our eyes on the figure until it faded into the shadows. Once we were out of sight, we ran, sprinting down the trail, my heartbeat thundering in my ears, my legs shaking with every step. We didn't stop until we'd reached the car, the safety of civilization a mere illusion against whatever was lurking out there in the woods. We never spoke about it again, but for years afterward, I'd catch my dad staring out the window on rainy nights, his gaze distant, his face drawn tight, as if he was still back there, listening to those footsteps just outside the tent. He never went camping again, and neither did I. It's hard for me to talk about this, but maybe that's why I'm here. There's no ghosts, no monsters, no hidden messages. Just what happened to me, and it's as real as it gets. You'll probably think I'm crazy, but that's what everyone said, so nothing new there. This was about 2 years ago. I was in a really dark place in my life, and maybe I still am, honestly. I had recently moved back to my small hometown after my dad passed away. He had a heart attack at 62, no warning, nothing. One minute he was there, the next he wasn't. My mom couldn't handle the house alone. She'd been losing her memory bit by bit, like someone pulling on a loose thread. By the time I moved back, she barely remembered my name, let alone how to live on her own. Our house is on a stretch of land outside town, a few acres surrounded by thick trees. We used to spend every summer in that backyard, my dad firing up the grill, my mom setting up folding chairs in the grass. Those were the good years, the safe ones. But after my dad died, that land felt different, emptier somehow, like it was holding its breath. For the first few months, it was just me and my mom, coasting along in the limbo of routines, breakfast, pills, checking if she was wearing her shoes before wandering outside. But then came the sleepwalking. I'd find her at night, wandering through the halls, eyes open but vacant, like she was seeing something I couldn't. Sometimes she'd end up in the kitchen, muttering about things that made no sense, things from her childhood, people who'd been dead for years. Most nights, I'd guide her back to bed, tell her everything was okay, and she'd fall asleep almost instantly. Then one night, I heard her outside. I'd fallen asleep on the couch after one of those long, restless nights. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the creak of the screen door slamming shut. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and ran to the back door. Sure enough, she was out there, barefoot, wandering toward the edge of the yard where the trees met the field. She wasn't walking aimlessly this time. She had this focus like she knew exactly where she was going. I called her name, but she didn't respond, didn't even pause. So I went after her, moving as fast as I could without scaring her. I finally caught up and gently grabbed her arm, but she jerked away. She'd never done that before, and it took me by surprise. Her face was blank, like she didn't even recognize me, and her voice sounded so different when she spoke. "It's not safe here," she whispered. Her eyes were fixed on the dark line of trees, and her hand was trembling in mine. I kept trying to bring her back, telling her it was fine, that she just needed to come inside. But she kept muttering, talking about him, and how he's waiting, how he always finds his way back. I didn't know what to do, so I just wrapped my arm around her, gently guiding her back toward the house. When we got inside, she seemed to snap out of it, blinking like she'd just woken up. She looked at me, confused, and asked why we were up so late. I played it off, made up some excuse, and eventually got her back into bed. For the next few weeks, the sleepwalking got worse. It didn't matter what I did. She'd find her way outside, heading to that same spot by the tree line. And every time, she'd be whispering about him, about how he's waiting, how he won't go away. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to wait by the door, right at the edge of the yard, and keep an eye on her. If she went toward the trees again, I'd be ready. She didn't wake up until almost 4 a.m., and I watched as she moved through the house, her face slack, eyes empty. She walked right past me and out the back door. But this time, she wasn't heading to the trees. She was heading toward the old shed in the far corner of the yard, the one my dad used to store his tools and hunting gear in. She reached the door of the shed and just stood there, staring at it. I was about to go to her, bring her back inside, when she suddenly reached out and pulled the door open. I felt this strange pang in my stomach, like something was wrong, like I shouldn't be there watching her do this. Inside, there was nothing but old equipment, a dusty workbench, and a bunch of boxes my dad had stored there. But my mom didn't seem to see any of it. She just stared into the dark, mumbling under her breath, and I swear I saw her step back like something had startled her. I took a step forward, ready to pull her out of there, but then she turned around. She was wide awake now, looking right at me with this strange expression, half fear, half anger. She started whispering again, but this time it wasn't about him. She was looking right at me, saying my name over and over, then something that hit me like a punch in the chest. "It's you. You let him in," she said, her voice soft but sharp, like she was accusing me. "You should have known better. You opened the door." I didn't know what to say. I tried to bring her back inside, but she wouldn't budge, kept staring at me with that awful look. Eventually, I had to practically drag her, and even then, she kept muttering, kept telling me I'd made a mistake, that I'd let him back in. After that, she stopped sleepwalking, but she never looked at me the same way again. Every time I'd walk into the room, she'd go quiet, her gaze following me with a strange intensity, like she was watching someone she didn't quite recognize. She stopped calling me by my name, started referring to me as him or you, like I was a stranger she couldn't quite place. The doctors called it a progression in her dementia, said it was common, that I should expect it to worsen. But the feeling it left me with, it wasn't just sadness. It was guilt, something dark and deep that I couldn't shake. The final straw was a few months later. I was cleaning out the shed, trying to get rid of some of my dad's old stuff, things that I knew we'd never use. My mom had taken to sitting by the window, watching me from inside, her eyes fixed on me with this cold, distant look. I was moving boxes, sweeping out the dust, when I saw it. a small, hand-carved wooden box hidden under a pile of old blankets. I'd never seen it before, but when I opened it, I found a stack of photos. They were of my mom, taken from a distance. Her on the porch, her standing by the edge of the yard, her staring out into the trees. They looked old, like they'd been taken years ago, but there was something off about them. Her face was expressionless in every photo, eyes wide, unfocused. It was like she'd been sleepwalking back then too, like she'd been waiting. I threw the box back into the pile, locked the shed, and went inside. I don't know what it meant or who took those photos. I just know that after I saw them, I couldn't look my mom in the eye. Every time I did, it felt like she knew something I didn't, something she'd been carrying all these years. Something about my dad, or me, or the house. She'd look at me with that same accusatory expression, like she was silently blaming me for everything that had happened. I moved her into a care home shortly after that, and I barely visit. She doesn't recognize me anymore, doesn't even react when I walk in the room. But I can't shake the feeling that she knew something I didn't, something that went deeper than just her memory slipping away. Maybe it was all in her head. Maybe it's in mine too. But every time I drive by that house, I can feel her words hanging in the air, echoing through my mind, telling me I'd let something in. And I still can't figure out if she meant it was something inside me, or if it was something waiting in the house all along, something she'd always been waiting for. I haven't spoken to anyone about this, and honestly, I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain it properly. Even writing this feels dangerous, like somehow I'm inviting it back, but I don't know how to keep it bottled up anymore. It started last month. I'd recently started renting a cheap little studio on the edge of town, the kind of place people live in when they're between jobs or running from something. For me, it was both. I left my last job suddenly, and without much explanation after things got weird. I was starting to think maybe I was cursed or haunted, because ever since then strange things had been happening, small things, but enough to get under my skin. My keys would disappear and reappear in places I knew I hadn't left them. I'd hear faint scratching sounds coming from the walls late at night. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just an old building settling. One evening, I was unpacking some boxes in my new place when I noticed a closet door in the corner of the room. It was small and unremarkable, like it hadn't been used in years, so I hadn't bothered to check it. But I wanted the space for storage, so I decided to open it up and see if it was usable. When I pulled open the door, there was a narrow staircase leading down. That threw me off because the landlord hadn't mentioned anything about a basement, and there was no other access point to it from outside the building. It wasn't a huge place, so I figured the basement would have been obvious. But it was there, these steps descending into a thick darkness that seemed to swallow the light from my phone. I called the landlord to ask about it, but he sounded confused. "No basement," he said. "That's probably just an old broom closet. The building's 100 years old. Some rooms are sealed off, but there's definitely no basement." I was about to argue, but something in his tone felt wrong, like he was nervous. He quickly said he had to go and hung up without answering any of my other questions. At that point, I was curious. I couldn't see much past the first few steps, but I could feel a draft coming from below, an icy breeze that made me shiver. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside and began to descend, taking one step at a time, the air growing colder with each one. The stairway creaked under my feet, and the smell down there was wrong, like damp earth mixed with something metallic. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, unfinished room. The walls were bare concrete, cracked and damp, and the only light was the dim beam from my phone. There was nothing in the room, no furniture, no boxes, just this sense of emptiness that felt oppressive, like the walls themselves were watching me. Then I saw something carved into the far wall, almost hidden in the shadows. As I got closer, I realized it was a single word scratched roughly into the concrete. "Leave." I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't sure if it was some old graffiti or a warning, but something about it felt personal, like it was meant for me. I backed up, ready to get out of there, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone breathing, shallow and ragged, like they were right behind me. I spun around, my phone's light bouncing off the walls, but there was no one there. The sound stopped, but the feeling didn't. I could sense something watching me, close enough to reach out and touch. I bolted back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock it. That night, I tried to forget about it, convincing myself it was just an old and used room, nothing more. But when I finally fell asleep, I had the most vivid dream, or at least I think it was a dream. I was lying in bed, unable to move, staring up at the ceiling as something crept up the side of my mattress, inching closer and closer. I could feel the weight pressing down, pinning me in place, my body paralyzed as cold fingers traced lightly down my arm. I tried to scream, but nothing came out, and then it whispered in my ear, a voice so faint I could barely make out the words. "Why didn't you listen?" I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow retreating into the corner of the room, but when I blinked, it was gone. After that night, things escalated. Every evening, just as the sun set, I'd hear faint whispers coming from behind the closet door. They were muffled, unintelligible, but I knew they were coming from that basement. I tried blocking the door, even shoved my dresser in front of it, but every morning I'd find the door cracked open, the dresser pushed slightly to the side like something was coming up at night, making its way into my apartment. One night, desperate for sleep, I finally decided to set up my phone to record while I slept. I wanted proof, something to show myself in the morning that it was all in my head. I set the phone on my nightstand, hit record, and eventually drifted off, still terrified but too exhausted to care. The next morning, I hesitated before looking at the recording. Part of me didn't want to know, didn't want to see what might be lurking in the dark. But I had to know. I pressed play, and for the first hour, it was just me sleeping, everything peaceful and quiet. Then around 3 a.m., the screen flickered, the sound cut out, and when it came back, I saw myself. I was sitting up in bed, staring directly into the camera, my eyes wide, unblinking, but I had no memory of waking up. My mouth opened, and I started whispering something, my voice low and raspy, like I'd been screaming for hours. I could barely make out the words, but it sounded like I was saying, "It's coming, it's coming, it's coming." Then, something else came into view, a shadow moving across the wall behind me, growing larger until it filled the entire screen. The camera suddenly went black, and when the picture returned, the bed was empty. I was gone. The recording ended there. I don't remember what happened after that. I must have been in some kind of daze because the next thing I remember is waking up in the living room, lying on the floor with no idea how I got there. My phone was still on the nightstand, the recording file corrupted when I tried to play it back. Since that night, I can't sleep in that room. I moved my mattress to the living room, keeping the closet door tightly locked and blocked with whatever heavy furniture I could find. But every night, just past midnight, I still hear those whispers, coming from deep below, just loud enough to make out two words, repeated over and over. "Let me in." I don't even know how to start this. It still feels surreal, and every time I try to tell someone, I stop myself afraid that saying it out loud might somehow make it worse. But the truth is, I don't know how to deal with it on my own, and I keep thinking that if I write it down, maybe it'll start to make sense. Maybe I'll stop feeling like I'm being watched. It started with a message on my phone, just a single notification from an unknown number, right as I was leaving work one evening. The message just said, "You dropped this," followed by a picture of a silver key on a concrete sidewalk. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the screen, feeling a strange sense of dread creep over me. I hadn't lost the key, and there was no indication of who'd sent the message. A weird prank, I thought, trying to brush it off. I deleted the message and kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I got home, I triple-checked my keys. Everything was where it should be: apartment key, mailbox, car, all there. I told myself it was just some random spam message, maybe even a mistake. The next night, around the same time, I got another message from the same unknown number. This time it was just a photo, a grainy, dimly lit image of a street corner. At first I didn't recognize it, but then it hit me. It was my street, taken from somewhere down the block, aimed right at my building. The caption read, "Are you missing something?" I felt my pulse spike. My mind went 100 different places. Some creep, someone trying to scare me, maybe even a friend playing a twisted joke. But as I stood there, staring at the picture, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched right then and there. I rushed to my window and looked out. scanning the dark street below, but there was no one there, just empty sidewalks and the quiet hum of streetlights. I blocked the number, deleted the messages, and convinced myself that whoever it was would give up if I didn't respond. But the next night, they found a way around that. The message came in on a different number, one I hadn't blocked, with another image. This one was from inside my building's lobby. The photo was blurry, like it was taken in a hurry, but it was unmistakably the entrance to my apartment building, and the caption simply said, "Almost there." I felt my stomach drop. I didn't understand how someone had gotten inside without a key, but the idea of confronting whoever it was made my blood run cold. I called the building management the next day, told them someone was stalking me, asked if they could check the security footage, but they just brushed me off, told me it was probably just someone trying to mess with me. They wouldn't even check the cameras. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind outside my window felt like a threat. I kept my phone on silent, too afraid to check for messages, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that it would stop if I ignored it long enough. But around 2 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for my phone, dreading what I might see. There were 3 new messages, all from that same unknown number. The first one was a photo of my front door. I knew it was mine because of the scratch marks by the lock where I'd accidentally scraped my key one night. Whoever it was had been just outside, close enough to touch it. My hands started to shake, and I forced myself to open the next message, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The second message was a recording, a short audio clip. I hesitated, fear clawing up my throat, but curiosity won out. I played it, and at first, all I could hear was static, faint crackling, maybe breathing, and then, just barely audible, a voice whispered my name, slowly, drawing out each syllable like a taunt. My skin crawled, and I fumbled to pause the recording, feeling the room close and around me. They knew my name. Somehow, they knew my name. The final message was just 2 words. "Let me in." I locked every door, turned on every light in my apartment, and sat in my living room, phone clutched tightly in my hand, waiting for something, anything, to happen. I don't know how long I sat there, my mind reeling, imagining every worst-case scenario, until finally, the exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless, nightmare-filled sleep. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, but the messages kept coming, always around the same time each night. Sometimes it was a photo, my front door, my window, even one of the hallway just outside my bedroom. Sometimes it was audio, recordings of faint whispers, or worse, sounds of something tapping, scratching, like someone trying to find a way inside. One night, after a particularly terrifying message, a video of my apartment door from the outside, shaky and close enough to see the grain of the wood, I decided to stay somewhere else. I went to a hotel, turned my phone off, hoping that if I just got away from my apartment, whoever it was would lose interest, give up. But when I turned my phone back on the next day, there was a message waiting for me. This time it was a photo of the hotel lobby. No caption, just the image. I didn't go back to my apartment. I moved in with a friend, left most of my things behind, started looking for a new place to live. I even got a new phone, a new number, figuring that might shake whoever it was. For a few days, things were quiet. I thought, maybe I'd finally escaped. But then last night, it started again. A message came through, this time to my friend's phone. It was a photo of the house we were staying in, taken from across the street. It didn't feel like a random shot. It felt like a threat, like they were telling me that no matter where I went, no matter what I did, they would find me. The caption said, "You can't hide. I don't know what to do anymore. Every night, I feel like I'm waiting for the next message, the next proof that they're out there, watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I don't feel safe anywhere. It's like they're always one step behind, slipping into the shadows, unseen but ever present, always there." It was the kind of night that felt almost too quiet, the hum of distant city lights barely reaching my apartment window. I was up late, the clock blinking past midnight, when I heard the faint beeping. It was that low, nagging sound, the kind you don't notice right away, but once you do, it's impossible to ignore. I groaned, assuming it was the smoke alarm running out of batteries again, and went to grab a chair to reach it. As I climbed up, I realized that it wasn't the smoke detector at all. It was the carbon monoxide detector, blinking with a red light in the hallway. My heart did a strange flip. I remembered some vaguely important bit about carbon monoxide being the silent killer, but the thought had never felt real. I figured it was probably just a malfunction, maybe dust or something triggering a false alarm. But the red light blinked insistently, as if demanding to be taken seriously. My first instinct was to open the windows just in case and grab my phone to look up what to do. As I scrolled through search results, I saw it in black and white. If the alarm goes off, get out. Simple as that, but the command struck me hard. My apartment didn't even smell like anything, didn't feel like anything was wrong. I almost ignored it, but there was something about that line, a stark reminder that I didn't have to smell or see anything for it to be dangerous. I threw on my shoes, grabbed my keys, and walked out, feeling ridiculous as I stood in the hall with the detector still shrieking inside. I called the fire department, expecting to be told it was a false alarm. But they arrived in minutes, geared up and carrying portable sensors. They didn't hesitate for a second. The lead firefighter asked me if I was feeling dizzy or lightheaded, which to my surprise, I was, though I hadn't really noticed until then. He nodded seriously and told me I'd done the right thing by getting out immediately. Watching them work, moving swiftly and carefully through my small apartment, I felt a chill. Their handheld sensors confirmed it. There was a leak. The carbon monoxide levels weren't high enough to be fatal yet, but they were climbing. They traced it to a faulty heater in my living room, one that I'd just turned on that evening as the weather had started getting colder. The firefighters shut off the gas, ensuring it was safe, but they advised me to stay out until it could be professionally repaired. They told me stories about people who hadn't been so lucky, people who'd ignored the alarm or didn't have one at all. Standing in the dim hallway, hearing the gravity in their voices, I felt grateful that I'd listened to that alarm, that small, persistent sound that had saved me from something I couldn't even see. That night, I stayed at a friend's place, lying awake thinking about how close I'd come to a dangerous situation without even realizing it. It's strange how we expect danger to announce itself with flashing lights, sirens, or drama. But carbon monoxide is invisible, odorless, creeping into your lungs quietly. I found myself wondering about all the other things in life that can turn deadly without warning, all the hazards we never really think about until they're staring us in the face. One story led to another in my mind, and I found myself thinking of the time I'd almost drowned in a lake as a kid. My family had rented a cabin by the water, and I'd gone out alone, wading into what I thought was shallow water. I'd been so confident splashing around, not noticing that I'd drifted out too far. Suddenly, my feet slipped, and I couldn't feel the bottom. I tried to stay calm, but my arms started thrashing, and each gasp seemed to pull me down a little more. I remembered thinking, this can't be happening. It's just water. But the lake didn't care. It had pulled me in quietly, effortlessly, without fanfare. I don't remember exactly how I got back to shore that day, only that I felt a new kind of respect for water after that, an awareness of its silent power. Since that night with the carbon monoxide leak, I've started paying attention to the subtle things, the barely noticeable cues that we so often brush off. I think about the time my dad had nearly choked on a piece of steak at a family dinner, the noise disappearing from the room as he tried to cough it up, panic in his eyes. For a moment, we all froze, the possibility of what was happening dawning too slowly. Luckily, my mom acted fast, giving him a hard smack between his shoulder blades that dislodged it. But I still remember that moment, the realization of how close things could have come to a tragic turn in an instant. Or the time my coworker, Joe, slipped in the bathroom at work and hit his head on the tile floor. We all thought he was just embarrassed, brushing it off as a minor fall. But an hour later, he was feeling dizzy, and by that afternoon, he was in the ER with a brain bleed. He ended up recovering, but it was a close call, the kind that rattled everyone in the office. It made me realize how fragile we are, how a small slip could have life-altering consequences. I even started looking at my own habits differently. I used to keep a space heater near my bed, one of those small ones that glowed a comforting orange. But after hearing so many stories of house fires caused by heaters tipping over or overheating, I moved it across the room, far from anything that could catch fire. I started checking my smoke detectors religiously, changing batteries even when they didn't need it, and made sure I knew where the fire extinguishers were in my building. It's funny how we walk around every day, surrounded by risks we never think about, protected by little more than a bit of plastic and a few warning sounds. But now, whenever I hear an alarm, be it a smoke detector, a fire alarm in a restaurant, or even the beep of a microwave timer, I stop and pay attention. I no longer brush them off as annoyances, but as reminders, as signals to take a pause and consider what they might be protecting me from. Life doesn't always announce danger with bold signs and flashing lights. Often, it's just a small sound, a faint beeping in the quiet of the night. And if we're lucky enough to hear it and wise enough to listen, maybe that's what keeps us safe. It happened on the last night of my shift as a night watchman at the old Hartfield Library. The place was scheduled for renovations, so they closed it off to the public a few weeks before, leaving the building empty and dark except for me. It wasn't a bad gig, quiet, decent pay, and I got to catch up on reading between rounds. My only job was to walk the floors every hour, make sure no one had snuck in, and keep an eye out for any signs of leaks or fire hazards. That night, I was making my last round, and I was looking forward to finishing up early, maybe grabbing a late-night burger on the way home. I just started on the 3rd floor, where the older historical archives were stored, dusty, and used books and fragile documents no one had touched in years. There was a stillness to that floor that always felt heavier than the others, like the air itself was weighed down by the history in those shelves. As I walked past the rows of bookcases, my flashlight skimmed over familiar spines, their titles long faded. Just as I was turning to head back, something caught my eye, movement in the shadows near the far end of the room. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I was the only one there, or at least I was supposed to be. I figured it was probably my imagination, but curiosity got the better of me. I made my way down the aisle, stepping quietly, my flashlight sweeping across the floor and the shelves, looking for anything out of place. When I reached the end, I saw it. A single book lying open on the floor, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. It was odd, because I knew the books on that floor hadn't been touched in years, and I was certain it hadn't been there on my previous round. I bent down, shining my light on the open page. The words seemed to swim under the beam, blurry and hard to read, but one word stood out, repeated several times. Help. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to a prank from whoever had left it there, or maybe just a weird coincidence. I picked up the book, planning to put it back on the shelf, but as I held it, I noticed something strange. The air around me felt colder, like someone had left a window open, though all the windows on that floor were sealed shut. And then from somewhere nearby, I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. My name. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I turned, shining my flashlight around, but the room was empty. The shelves cast long, eerie shadows, and the silence seemed to stretch, filling the room with a presence I couldn't explain. I took a step back, clutching the book, feeling a prickle of fear climb up my spine. That's when I heard it again, my name, whispered softly, as if from just over my shoulder. I spun around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. The hair on my arm stood up, and I felt a tightness in my chest, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Hello, I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. Is anyone there? Silence. But as I stood there, straining to listen, the whispers returned, low and insistent, as if they were coming from all around me. They grew louder, layering over each other until they became a chorus of voices, pleading, begging, repeating the same word over and over. Help, help, help. My hands shook as I gripped the flashlight, and I took a shaky step back, my mind racing with every horror story I'd ever read. I turned to leave, ready to abandon the book and make a run for it. But just as I turned, a shadow flickered in my peripheral vision. I whipped the flashlight around, catching a glimpse of something, a figure standing at the end of the aisle, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes dark and hollow. She wore a faded dress, her hair hanging in damp, tangled strands. She stared at me, unblinking, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing down on me, the voices growing louder, surrounding me. "Please," she whispered, her voice threading through the cacophony. "Help us." I don't remember how I managed to turn and run, but somehow I found myself bolting down the aisle, my heart pounding as I stumbled through the darkness. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more desperate, filling the space with a pleading I couldn't escape. I didn't stop running until I burst through the doors and out into the cold night air, gasping, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The whispers faded as I left the building, the stillness of the night settling around me like a blanket. I quit the job the next day, leaving my badge and keys with the supervisor, who barely looked up as I mumbled an excuse about a family emergency. I didn't care about the paycheck. All I wanted was to get as far from that place as possible. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the memory of those whispers echoing in my ears. I'd hear my name in quiet moments, feel a chill whenever I passed by dark rooms, see shadows flicker at the edge of my vision. I never went back to the library, but sometimes, late at night, I think about that woman, standing alone among the shelves, her face etched into my memory, her whispered plea haunting me. "Help us!" I still can't believe this happened, and if I'm being honest, I don't know if anyone else would either. But I need to get this out, even if it just lives here on the internet, ignored. I've been questioning my sanity since it happened, wondering if I misremembered or somehow twisted it in my head. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and how it felt to be truly helpless. It started because of a freelance gig I found online. I was between jobs and scrambling to pay my bills when I saw an ad that seemed too good to be true. The listing was vague, just needs skilled photographer for a high-paying one-night project. I thought maybe it was a wedding or some kind of event. I didn't think twice, just sent my portfolio over, and they got back to me almost immediately. The instructions were simple. Meet at a specified address just outside town at 9 p.m. sharp. They would provide the equipment, and I'd get paid in cash. The offer was 5 times what I normally made, so I figured I'd be stupid to say no. The address led me to an old, abandoned mansion on a hill, miles away from any other buildings. The place was enormous, the kind of home you'd see in old, faded black and white photos, with boarded-up windows and ivy snaking up the walls. As I pulled up, there were no other cars in sight, and the only light came from a few dim lanterns placed along the pathway leading to the front door. The whole place had this eerie, forgotten feel, but I told myself it was just an unconventional location for a shoot. When I got out of my car, I felt this weird, prickling sensation like I was being watched. I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I forced myself to walk up to the front door, where I found a note taped to it. "Enter and go to the second floor. Your equipment is ready." I hesitated, feeling a pit form in my stomach. But I'd driven over an hour to get there, and I didn't want to blow what could be a huge payday. So I took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The interior was even more unsettling than the outside. It was dark and dusty, with furniture covered in white sheets, casting strange, ghostly shapes in the dim light. The air was thick, stale, like no one had stepped foot in there for decades. Every step I took echoed through the empty halls. The second floor creaked underfoot as I made my way up, and I found myself wondering why anyone would pay so much for a shoot in a place like this. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw a small room down the hallway with the faint glow of a lamp inside. I followed it and found a camera set up on a tripod just as the note had said. Next to it was another note: "Stand here and shoot every 5 minutes." No other instructions, no one else in sight. I looked around, calling out to see if anyone was there, but the house swallowed my voice. I was completely alone. I checked the camera, wondering if maybe it was rigged to capture something on a timer, but it seemed like a regular DSLR, albeit a very high-end one. I thought about leaving, but that payday kept nagging at me. I was already there, and all I had to do was stand there and snap a few photos. So I waited, counting down the seconds on my watch until the first shot. When the time came, I lifted the camera, pointed it down the hallway, and snapped. The flash briefly illuminated the dusty corridor, but the image looked empty, just a dim, hazy hallway in a creepy old mansion. I shrugged. checked my watch, and waited for the next 5 minutes to pass. When the second shot came, I raised the camera again and took another photo. This time, I thought I saw something strange on the preview screen, a faint shadow at the end of the hall, but when I looked up, there was nothing there. I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light, a smudge on the lens maybe, and waited for the next shot. But by the third photo, I was sweating, and I could feel the hairs on my neck standing on end. The shadow was back, clearer this time, almost like a person standing just at the edge of the darkness. But again, when I looked down the hall, there was nothing. I thought about turning the flash off to avoid spooking myself, but something told me I needed the light, that it was the only thing keeping me safe. As I took the fourth photo, my heart skipped a beat. The shadow was no longer at the end of the hall. It had moved closer, halfway down now, just faintly visible on the preview screen. My hands shook as I checked the lens, convinced there must be some explanation. But the lens was spotless. I looked up, shining my phone's flashlight down the hall, but it was empty. I was alone, and yet I knew I wasn't. I was tempted to just grab my things and leave, but a sick part of me needed to take the next shot just to be sure. When the fifth shot came, I steadied my hand, aimed down the hallway, and pressed the button. The figure was clear now, standing just outside the circle of light cast by my camera's flash. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its body draped in what looked like tattered black fabric, like shadows clinging to a frame. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and though I couldn't see its face, I could feel it staring right at me through the lens, watching me with a dark, predatory intent. My breath caught in my throat, and I knew I had to leave, had to get out before the next shot. But just as I turned, I heard a faint whisper coming from down the hall, a voice that sounded like it was right behind me, calling my name, low and echoing. I bolted, sprinting down the stairs, not caring if I left the camera, not caring about the money. My only thought was to get out. But as I reached the front door, I found it wouldn't budge. I pulled, yanked, even tried kicking it, but it felt like it was sealed shut. The whisper grew louder, closer, a low, guttural sound that filled the house, reverberating off the walls, pressing down on me like a weight. Panicked, I ran to a window, trying to pry it open, but it was painted shut. I looked over my shoulder, and there, at the top of the stairs, was the figure standing motionless, its head still tilted, watching me with that same unblinking intensity. I ran deeper into the house, my only thought to find another exit, but every door I tried was locked, every window sealed. I could hear the footsteps now, slow and deliberate, echoing through the halls as it followed me, never speeding up, never slowing down, just keeping that same steady pace. Eventually, I ended up back in the room with the camera, cornered and desperate. I picked up the camera, almost on instinct, and snapped one last photo, hoping maybe it would somehow break whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. When I looked at the screen, I saw myself standing in the room, looking terrified, and behind me, clear as day, was the figure reaching out with one skeletal hand, fingers impossibly long, just inches from my shoulder. That was when everything went black. I woke up in my car the next morning, parked in front of the mansion. My equipment was gone, the cash payment sitting neatly on the passenger seat. I don't remember driving home, don't remember anything after taking that last photo. But when I got home, there was a new message in my inbox from the same anonymous email. Job well done. We'll be in touch. Since that night, I haven't touched my camera. But every now and then, when I'm walking alone or sitting in my apartment, I catch a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. A shadowy figure, thin and tall, just watching. I haven't told anyone this story, and I don't know if I ever will. But I have to get it out somehow, because it's eating away at me, and the nightmares haven't stopped since it happened. I don't know if they ever will. It was last winter, around late December. I had decided to take a solo road trip to clear my head after a rough breakup. There's something about driving alone at night, with only the hum of the engine and the stretch of empty highway, that feels freeing, like you're leaving all the baggage behind in the rearview mirror. I didn't have a set destination, just a rough idea that I'd drive up through the mountains, find some place to stay, then make my way back after a few days. The first few days went as planned. I stayed at a cheap but cozy inn by a lake, hiked some trails, and spent the evenings watching movies in bed, trying to forget. It was peaceful, almost therapeutic. By the fourth day, I felt like I was ready to head home, as though I'd scraped off enough of the pain to face reality again. That night, I left around midnight, hoping to make the most of the empty roads. The first few hours were uneventful, just the long, dark stretches of mountain road, my headlights cutting through the mist. It was around 3 in the morning when I noticed something odd in the distance. A pair of hazard lights flashing up ahead, blinking orange in the dark. As I got closer, I saw it was a car, parked on the side of the road, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. I slowed down, instinct kicking in. Maybe someone had broken down and needed help. But as I pulled up alongside the car, I realized it was empty. The driver's door was wide open, and the headlights were still on, casting a weak yellow glow onto the road. I could see bags in the back seat, a phone charger hanging from the dash, as if someone had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any second. I should have driven off right then. I should have just left, but something made me stop. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was worry, wondering if someone was hurt, lost, or worse. So, I pulled over and got out, leaving my own car running. The cold mountain air hit me as I stepped onto the asphalt, and an uneasy silence pressed in, broken only by the hum of my engine and the flicker of those hazard lights. I called out, my voice echoing into the trees. "Hello? Is anyone there?" No answer. I stepped closer to the open door, feeling the urge to just get back in my car grow stronger, but I ignored it. I peered inside, looking for any sign of the driver, a wallet, an ID, anything, but there was nothing, just those bags and a faint smell of perfume lingering in the cold. As I was about to turn back to my car, I saw something on the ground a few feet away. It looked like footprints, barely visible in the dirt at the edge of the road, leading into the trees. I hesitated, trying to reason with myself. Maybe they'd gone off to get help. Maybe someone had picked them up. But the thought of someone wandering in the woods, lost and alone, gnawed at me. Against every ounce of my better judgment, I took out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and followed the tracks into the trees. The forest was thick and silent, branches creaking in the wind, the ground soft and damp beneath my feet. The footprints continued, leading deeper into the darkness, and before long, I was far enough from the road that I couldn't hear my car engine anymore. The air was colder, and I felt a strange pressure, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. That's when I saw it. A dark shape just up ahead, huddled low to the ground. For a second, my heart jumped, thinking I'd found the driver. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a person. It was something else, something that made my skin crawl, though I couldn't understand why. The shape looked like a bundle of clothes, almost like someone had left their coat in a pile. But as my flashlight hit it, I saw a face staring back at me. An old, worn mask, the kind you'd see in a thrift shop with empty eyes and a cracked smile. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But before I could move, I heard something behind me. A faint rustling like someone or something moving through the trees. I whipped around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing there, just the empty forest stretching in all directions. My mind raced. I was alone, or at least, I thought I was. But then, as I turned back to the mask, I saw it had moved. It was sitting a few feet closer than before, the empty eyes staring right at me, that smile twisting like it knew something I didn't. Panic took over. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering, nearly dropping my phone as I scrambled to turn and run. I tore through the trees, branches scratching at my face and hands, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Every few steps, I glanced back, half expecting to see that mask hovering right behind me. When I burst back onto the road, I saw my car up ahead, still running, the headlights casting long shadows. But as I reached the car, I saw something else, another figure, standing just beyond the light. It was a person, a man, tall and thin, with his back to me, dressed in old, tattered clothes. His shoulders were hunched, and he was just standing there, motionless, like he'd been waiting for me. I stopped, too terrified to move, as he slowly turned to face me. His face was obscured in shadow, but his eyes glinted in the light, fixed on me with an intensity that felt unnatural, like he was sizing me up, deciding what to do next. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at each other, but finally, he took a slow step toward me, his foot crunching on the gravel. That was all it took. I lunged for my car door, throwing myself inside and locking it, fumbling with the gear shift as I floored the gas. I didn't look back as I sped away, my heart racing, hands shaking, my mind a blur of panic and fear. The forest rushed past me, and I drove for miles, not daring to stop, not even daring to look in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop until the sun started to rise, pulling over at a gas station off the highway. My face was pale, my hands still trembling as I tried to steady my breathing. Part of me wanted to go back, to find some explanation for what I'd seen, to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. When I finally looked at my phone, there was a new message from an unknown number. I opened it, my stomach twisting in knots, and saw a single photo. It was of my car, parked on that empty mountain road, taken from just behind the tree line. And there, standing beside my car, was the tall, thin man, staring straight at the camera, his face hidden beneath that old, cracked mask. I never went back to that road. I never told anyone what happened. But every night since then, I dream of that mask, those empty eyes watching, waiting. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel like I can still see him, standing just beyond the light, waiting for me to come back. I'm not sure why I'm even writing this down, but maybe it's just to see if anyone else has ever gone through something like this. I can't really talk about it with anyone I know, and I'm not even sure if it'll make sense on paper. It's all real, though. No weird mystical stuff. Just something that happened, and something I'll never forget. It started when I was working as a night shift manager at a 24-hour gas station on the edge of town. I'd been there for almost 3 years, and by now, I'd seen just about everything you could expect working at a job like that. Drunk people stumbling in at 3 a.m., truckers who looked like they hadn't slept in a week, the occasional shoplifter. But for the most part, it was just me, alone with the humming refrigerators and the flickering fluorescents, killing time until morning. I don't know if you've ever worked a night shift, but there's a sort of timelessness to it, like the hours just blend into each other. It's quiet, repetitive, and after a while, you start to feel like you're the only person left in the world. That's what I liked about it. Honestly, the world felt like it was on pause, and it was just me, the empty store, and the occasional straggler passing through. One night, around 2 a.m., a car pulled up. Nothing unusual about that. Cars would stop by every so often. I watched from behind the counter as this guy got out, tall and lanky, wearing a tattered hoodie and jeans. I got this weird feeling right away. It wasn't that he looked strange exactly, but there was something off about the way he was moving. Too stiff, too slow, like he wasn't used to being in his own body. He came inside, and as he passed under the fluorescent lights, I could see him better. His face was pale, gaunt, and his eyes, I don't know how to explain it. They looked wrong, like they were too wide or too intense. He didn't look at me as he walked in, which was a relief. I wasn't in the mood for a conversation. He drifted down one of the aisles, not picking anything up, not really looking around. He just kept his hands in his hoodie pockets, wandering slowly, step by step. Every so often, he'd stop, turn his head slightly, and then keep walking. I watched him for a while, feeling this uneasy knot form in my stomach. Something told me I should be paying attention to this guy. After a few minutes, he turned and started making his way toward the counter. He didn't have anything in his hands, which was unusual. People don't usually stop by a gas station at 2 a.m. for a leisurely stroll. As he got closer, I could feel my pulse picking up. My hands were sweating, and I couldn't take my eyes off him. He finally came to a stop a few feet from the counter and just stood there, looking at me with this blank, unblinking expression. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. But he didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open like he was about to say something but couldn't find the words. We stood there in silence for what felt like a full minute, just staring at each other. I was about to ask him to leave when he finally spoke, his voice low and hollow. "Do you have anything sharp?" His question threw me off. "Sharp?" I repeated, not sure I'd heard him right. "Yes," he said, still staring. "Something sharp." I should have just told him no, should have told him to get lost. But for some reason, I nodded and pointed toward the back wall, where we kept some basic tools. A few cheap pocket knives, utility knives, stuff like that. I thought maybe he was some guy passing through, needed to fix something in his car, whatever. I wanted to get him out of there as quickly as possible. He looked over his shoulder toward the back wall, but he didn't move. He just stood there, nodding slightly to himself, as if he'd just confirmed something he already knew. Then he turned back to me, and in the dim light of the gas station, his face looked even paler. I don't need to go back there, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Something in the way he said it sent a chill up my spine. I was starting to feel trapped behind that counter, like there was no way out if this guy decided to do something crazy. He kept standing there, his eyes fixed on me, and I felt this weird, gnawing fear building in my chest. Finally, I took a deep breath and asked, "Is there something I can help you with? Or do you need to head out?" He tilted his head slightly, almost like he was confused. "There's something wrong," he said slowly. "I think I left something here, a while back." That made no sense. Left something here? He nodded, his gaze drifting around the store. "Yes, something. I can't remember what it was, but I know it's here. I can feel it." I was getting seriously unnerved. There was something in the way he spoke, a kind of desperation that didn't fit with the empty words he was saying. Like he was trying to communicate something he couldn't quite explain, like he was stuck in some loop he couldn't get out of. I told him again, as calmly as I could, that if he wasn't going to buy anything, he'd need to leave. I didn't want to push him, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. He nodded, but didn't move. He just kept standing there, as if he'd forgotten how to leave. Then, finally, he turned and walked out the door, his movements as stiff and strange as before. I watched him get into his car, and I thought that was the end of it. But instead of pulling away, he just sat there, headlights off, his face barely visible through the windshield. For almost an hour, he just sat there staring at the gas station. I tried to ignore him, focus on my work, but every time I glanced outside, he was still there, eyes fixed on the building, on me. I started to feel this panic bubbling up, this irrational fear that he wasn't going to leave, that he was waiting for something only he understood. Finally, around 4 a.m., he started the car and drove off, disappearing down the empty road. But the feeling he left behind stuck with me, like a film of cold sweat that wouldn't dry. For the rest of the shift, I felt on edge, every small noise making me jump, my heart racing every time the automatic door swung open. Over the next few nights, he came back. Same time, same routine. He'd wander the aisles, sometimes talking to himself, other times just standing in front of the counter, staring at me. He'd ask about sharp things, or tell me he'd lost something in the store. Each night, he'd leave without buying anything, and each night, he'd sit in his car outside, staring at the gas station, at me. I told my manager, but he just shrugged it off, told me people are weird, especially at night. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? A guy keeps coming in and staring at me. It felt paranoid, but I knew something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. The last time he showed up, something was different. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. He stumbled into the store, barely able to keep his balance, his hands trembling. This time, he didn't even pretend to shop. He came straight to the counter, his face inches from mine, and whispered, "I know it's here." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just watched him as he leaned closer, his eyes glassy and wide. And then, without another word, he turned and walked out. He got in his car, and for the first time, he drove away without looking back. He hasn't come back since. But even now, when I work the night shift, I can feel the ghost of his presence in the aisles, like he left some part of himself there, lingering in the quiet. And every now and then, when I look out into the parking lot, I half expect to see him sitting in that car, headlights off, eyes fixed on me. When my friend Alex got hired for his dream job, we all thought he'd finally made it. It was at a big media company, the kind he'd been talking about for years. He was so excited. He'd gone through 5 rounds of interviews with panel discussions and project tests that had practically become his second job. The hiring manager said they were impressed, called him the perfect fit. But 2 weeks in, Alex was pulling 14-hour days, juggling responsibilities that weren't even in his job description. They were piling on projects, leaving him with no time to breathe, and overtime pay was just something whispered about in the hallways. Every time he hinted at burnout, his boss would just grin and say, "You're young. You've got energy to spare." It was like they thought he should be grateful just to be there, as if the title itself was payment enough. That same week, my roommate Lila was in line for tickets to a concert she'd been dying to see. The second they went on sale, she was ready, clicking as fast as she could. But within minutes, everything was sold out. It was déjà vu. This wasn't the first time this had happened, and we knew why. Scalper bots had snatched up the tickets, and within an hour, they were being resold online for triple the price. Lila was devastated, and she showed me the resale prices, her voice shaking with anger. "This was supposed to be for the fans," she said, scrolling through the absurd markups. "Now it's just a game for the rich. The people who actually care don't even get a chance." Around the same time, my dad was dealing with his own bout of bureaucratic madness. He's a contractor, the old-school kind who believes in shaking hands and keeping promises. But lately, he'd been losing jobs to companies that knew how to play the game, bidding low to win contracts, then padding the costs later with hidden fees. His latest client, an older couple he'd been working with for years, had been lured away by one of these companies. They called him heartbroken, explaining that they just couldn't pass up the deal they'd been promised. 2 weeks later, they were back on the phone, begging him to take over after discovering the deal was full of add-ons that would blow their budget. My dad just sighed and agreed to help. "There's no loyalty anymore," he said, shaking his head. "People get dazzled by promises and forget what's real." One night, Alex, Lila, and I met up for drinks, all of us in the mood to vent. Alex was still reeling from the reality of his job. "They sold me a fantasy," he said, downing his drink. "I thought I'd finally be doing meaningful work, but they're just using me to crank out content around the clock." Lila chimed in, saying how it felt like nothing was real anymore, like even tickets were just another commodity for the wealthy. "Everything's for sale," she said. "The concerts, the jobs, even our time." That's when Alex pulled out his phone and showed us a headline: a recent insider trading scandal involving a few Congress members. They dumped stocks just before a huge market dip, saving themselves a fortune, all while the rest of the country had to watch their portfolios tank. "Can you believe this?" Alex said, his voice incredulous. "These people are supposed to be working for us, but they're cashing in on every crisis." It felt like a slap in the face that the very people we were supposed to trust to keep things fair were the ones bending the rules. Then, as if on cue, Lila got a notification on her phone. She opened it, rolled her eyes, and turned her screen toward us. "Data tracking alert," she said. "Every app on my phone seems to want access to my location, my contacts, even my photos." She explained how she'd recently downloaded a weather app, and within days, she was getting ads for raincoats, boots, even camping gear. It felt like every part of her life was being monitored, packaged, and sold. "They're spying on us," she said, half laughing, but with a seriousness in her voice. "Privacy is a joke now." The kicker was when we started talking about a gambling ad we'd seen earlier that day. It showed some guy winning big, his friends cheering him on like he'd just achieved his dreams. It played during prime time, right when we were watching TV, making gambling look like the ultimate thrill. "It's everywhere now," Alex said, frowning. "I mean, they banned cigarette ads for being dangerous, but this? Gambling can ruin lives, but they're plastering it all over the place." Lila agreed, telling us about her cousin who'd recently racked up thousands of dollars in gambling debt after getting sucked into an online poker app. "It's addictive, and they know it," she said. "They're making money off people's worst impulses." As we walked home that night, a sense of frustration settled over us. We were living in a world where everything had a price tag, where even the simplest joys were auctioned off to the highest bidder, and the people who were supposed to protect us were busy cashing in on our blind trust. Alex shook his head as we reached his place, saying, "It's like we're all pawns in their game." None of us had an answer, but we all knew he was right. It was a few years ago, but I still think about it every time I pass an empty field. I was driving back from a wedding in the middle of nowhere, one of those rural towns where the only lights are the headlights from your car and maybe a flicker of a porch light in the distance. It was close to midnight, and I was already regretting my decision to take the back roads. My GPS had lost signal about 15 minutes earlier, but I figured if I just kept going, I'd eventually reach the highway. The road was a narrow, two-lane strip cutting through fields and farmland. The only sound the hum of my engine and the occasional whisper of wind through the open window. It was one of those clear, crisp nights where every star seemed close enough to touch. And for a while, I was mesmerized by the emptiness, the peace of it. But then, as I came around a bend, I saw something up ahead, a figure standing at the edge of the road, just barely illuminated by my headlights. At first, I thought it was a scarecrow, the way it stood so still, arms hanging loosely at its sides. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a tall, thin man dressed in dark clothing that looked oddly formal, like a suit or maybe a long coat. He wasn't hitchhiking or trying to flag me down. He was just standing there, staring into the distance. I slowed down as I passed him, a chill running down my spine. He didn't look at me, didn't even seem to notice my car passing just a few feet from him. He was so still, so unnaturally rigid, that for a moment I thought he wasn't real. Maybe a mannequin someone had put out as a prank. But as I looked at him in my rearview mirror, I swear I saw him take a step forward slowly, like he was moving toward the road. I shook it off, telling myself he was just a guy out for a strange, late-night walk. But a few minutes later, as I rounded another bend, there he was again, standing on the side of the road, the same tall, thin figure barely visible in the dark. This time, he was a little closer to the road, his face still turned away, staring into the fields. My stomach twisted. It couldn't be the same man. There was no way he could have gotten there before me. I pressed down on the gas, my heart pounding, trying to ignore the dread building in my chest. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the road, but every few seconds, I couldn't help but glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see him again. The road stretched out ahead, empty and dark, nothing but fields on either side. I told myself to calm down, that it was just a weird coincidence. Then, just as I was starting to relax, I saw him again, standing in the middle of the road this time, directly in my path. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as I came to a stop just a few feet from him. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. He was standing there, his back to me, his head slightly tilted, as if he were listening for something. I honked the horn, my voice shaking as I yelled, "Hey, are you okay?" He didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even flinch. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up, every instinct telling me to turn the car around and get out of there. But something about the way he stood, so unnaturally still, made me feel like I couldn't look away. Finally, after what felt like hours, he turned his head slightly, just enough that I could see the edge of his face in the glow of my headlights. His skin was pale, almost gray, his cheekbones sharp, his eyes sunken and dark, staring right through me with an expression I couldn't read. It was as if he were looking at something far beyond me, something only he could see. In that moment, I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, like I was in the presence of something I couldn't understand, something not meant to be seen by people like me. My throat went dry, and all I could think was I need to leave. I put the car in reverse. My gaze locked on him as I backed away slowly, not daring to turn around. He didn't move, just kept watching me with those hollow eyes, his head tilted at that unnatural angle. I hit the gas, spinning the car around, and sped down the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the road behind me. But he was gone, the road empty, as if he'd never been there at all. I didn't slow down until I reached the highway, my heart still racing, my mind reeling from what I'd seen. For weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the image of him, that pale face, those hollow eyes staring at me from the darkness. And even now, years later, I still avoid those back roads at night. Because somewhere deep down, I have this feeling that he's still out there, standing in the shadows, waiting for someone to come along. I'm a respiratory therapist in a busy urban hospital, so I get called into a lot of high-stress situations. My job is to keep people breathing when they can't do it on their own. Every day, I'm right there in the thick of it. Intubations, ventilators, suctioning fluids from airways, basically anything that keeps a person's lungs moving. It's not glamorous, and it's not easy. I've been in codes where we're doing chest compressions for 40 minutes, my hands numb, sweat pouring down my face. But there's one case, just a couple months back, that I can't seem to shake. It was a Tuesday night, mid-shift, when we got a code blue call, cardiac arrest in one of the emergency rooms. It was for a man in his 50s, brought in unresponsive after a collapse in a restaurant. His wife had ridden along in the ambulance, and by the time we arrived, she was pacing outside the room, looking half-crazed with worry. I could hear her telling one of the nurses, over and over, "He was fine. He was fine 5 minutes ago." When I walked into the room, the scene was controlled chaos. The man was on the bed, shirt cut open, chest bare, with a team working over him, trying to get his heart going again. I took my position at the head of the bed, prepping my equipment in case they needed to intubate. His face was pale, his skin already cold, and his pupils were blown. It was one of those cases where I knew, deep down, that this wasn't going to end well. But you don't think about that in the moment. You just do the job. They went through round after round of compressions, the doctors barking out orders, nurses cycling in and out, but nothing was working. I was about to step back when his wife burst into the room, pushing past everyone to get to him. She gripped his hand, sobbing, begging him to come back. We don't usually let family in during resuscitation, but no one had the heart to pull her away. She leaned down, whispered something into his ear that none of us could hear, and then, miraculously, his heart started up again. Just like that, the monitor showed a heartbeat slow but steady. Everyone stopped for a moment, caught off guard. We were all looking at each other, silently asking if anyone could explain what had just happened. His wife was crying, clinging to his hand, thanking us, thanking whatever higher power she believed in. And I stood there trying to shake off this weird, uneasy feeling. I'd seen people come back from codes before, but something about this didn't sit right. The man was stabilized and moved up to the ICU, where he was kept on a ventilator. He'd been without oxygen for long enough that we weren't sure if he'd have brain damage, and there was a chance he might never wake up. Over the next few days, I kept checking on him between my rounds, partly out of curiosity, partly because that unease hadn't left me. He lay there, still and quiet, his chest rising and falling with each mechanical breath, while his wife sat by his side, never leaving. On the fourth day, I walked in just as he started to stir. His fingers twitched, and his eyes fluttered open. His wife gasped, leaning over him, and I moved closer to check his vitals. He was groggy, disoriented, but there was something else. He looked panicked, like he'd just woken up from a nightmare. His breathing quickened, and I had to remind him to stay calm, that he was safe, that he was in the hospital. He looked up at me, eyes wide, and the first thing he said was, "Where is she?" His voice was weak, barely above a whisper, but there was an urgency in it that caught me off guard. His wife told him she was right there, holding his hand, but he shook his head, looking past her, staring around the room like he was searching for someone else. He repeated the question, "Where is she?" more urgently this time, and I could see his pulse starting to race on the monitor. I tried to reassure him, asked if he remembered what had happened, but he wouldn't focus. He kept mumbling about a woman, something about she was waiting, and she told me to come with her. I exchanged a glance with his wife, who looked just as confused, and after a few minutes, he drifted back into unconsciousness. Over the next couple of days, he kept slipping in and out of lucidity, each time asking the same question, "Where is she?" He'd become agitated, muttering things that didn't make sense, words that gave me chills. "She told me I was supposed to go with her," he'd say, or "I was almost there." His wife was beside herself, torn between relief that he was alive and fear over his strange behavior. She kept saying he'd never talked like this before, that he'd never been a superstitious or spiritual guy. A week later, he was well enough to be taken off the ventilator, breathing on his own again, but he still wasn't himself. He seemed haunted, distracted, as if part of him hadn't fully come back. During one of my last visits with him, I finally asked him if he remembered what he'd been talking about, if he remembered saying he was supposed to go with her. He looked at me, his face pale, his expression distant, and said, "She was waiting for me. I don't know who she was, but she was there, and I was supposed to go with her." I didn't press him further. He was clearly disturbed, and I didn't want to add to his stress. But his words stuck with me, leaving a gnawing sensation I couldn't shake. It was like he'd been somewhere none of us could see, like he'd brushed up against something we couldn't understand. And somehow he'd been pulled back. When he was discharged, I thought that would be the end of it, that I'd forget about the strange things he'd said. But a few weeks later, we got another cardiac arrest call, this time for a woman in her 70s. It was the same routine: compressions, IVs, defibrillator pads, the works. She'd been gone for a good 20 minutes when, out of nowhere, she started breathing again. I stood there, watching the monitor in shock, feeling that same eerie sense I'd felt with the man weeks earlier. And as she came around, the first thing she whispered, weak but clear as day, was, "Where is he?" It was subtle at first, a shift I could barely feel. The kind of thing you notice only when you're in love, when you've memorized every line of their face and every beat of their voice. With him, I had all those details stored somewhere deep in my mind, where they came together like a favorite song you never forget. We'd been together for almost 5 years, lived together for 2, and I thought I knew him better than I knew myself. But, as it turns out, that's what I wanted to believe. The first time I noticed the change, it was a rainy Sunday afternoon. We were supposed to spend the day together, just relaxing, catching up on a show we both loved. But his phone kept buzzing, lighting up on the table between us, and he'd turn away slightly each time he picked it up, laughing under his breath, or replying quickly before setting it back down. I thought nothing of it at first. He had friends. I had friends. Maybe someone was going through a rough time and needed a laugh, or maybe it was just a funny meme. But his attention drifted, his eyes never quite landing on mine the way they used to, and something felt off. I brushed it aside, pushed it deep down, convincing myself that everything was fine. After all, we had a good life together, didn't we? We shared our space, our dreams, our lives. So when he said he was going out for a drink after work with some new coworkers, I smiled and told him to have fun, even though something about it felt strange, hollow. The second time he went out after work, I felt a flicker of irritation. He'd started picking up longer shifts, or so he said, filling his nights with late work hours and team dinners. It was unlike him, this sudden burst of social energy, especially since he'd always preferred staying in, watching a movie with me on the couch. But I told myself he was just trying to impress his new boss or get along with the team, and I tried to be the supportive girlfriend, the one who trusted him without a shadow of doubt. It wasn't until a few weeks later that things took a turn. He was in the shower, his phone on the sink where he'd forgotten it. It buzzed, lighting up with a message preview from someone named M. It was just a single heart emoji, nothing more. I felt the world tilt, my stomach dropping as I stared at the screen. I knew I shouldn't, that it was a breach of trust to look, but my hands moved before I could stop them, swiping open his messages. What I found wasn't just casual flirtation. There were entire conversations, little jokes and nicknames, photos of meals they'd shared, messages exchanged at odd hours with promises of meeting up. I felt my heart break in real time, shattering with every word I read. My chest felt tight, and I could barely breathe as I realized that this M wasn't just a friend or a harmless flirtation. She was someone he cared about, someone he'd chosen over me. When he came out of the shower, I was sitting there, his phone in my hand, my face pale and my eyes red-rimmed. He froze, his face going slack as he registered the scene. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, but the tremor in it betrayed the storm raging inside me. He didn't deny it. Maybe he realized there was no point, that the truth was plain between us. He looked down, his shoulders slumping, and muttered something about how he'd met her at a work event, how they'd clicked, how it had just happened. The excuses were weak, like tissue paper trying to cover a flood, and I felt anger rise up, hot and sharp. I asked him how long it had been going on, why he hadn't just told me if he was unhappy. He couldn't answer, just stared at his feet, as if they held some kind of redemption. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't bear to stay in the same space, so I went out, walking the empty streets in the dead of night, my mind racing. Every memory we'd made together played in my head, tinged now with bitterness and betrayal. I felt like I was losing not just him, but the entire life I'd built around him. The next day, I told him he needed to leave. I didn't want to hear his explanations or his apologies. I'd heard enough, seen enough. He packed a bag quietly, casting glances in my direction, waiting for me to say something, to call him back. But I kept silent, watching him go with a sense of finality that felt both freeing and devastating. When the door closed, I collapsed onto the couch, feeling the weight of the last 24 hours hit me like a tidal wave. I sobbed, letting the pain wash over me, cleansing in its brutality. In the days that followed, I did what I could to erase him from my life. I deleted photos, put away his things, rearranged the apartment so it no longer looked like the place we'd shared. Friends reached out, some asking what had happened, others just offering a quiet shoulder to lean on. I'd tell the story in fragments, never able to say it all at once, afraid that if I did, it would break me all over again. Healing was slow, a gradual process of rediscovering myself outside of us. I picked up old hobbies, things I'd set aside because they didn't fit neatly into our shared routine. I spent time with friends I hadn't seen in ages, laughing with a freedom I hadn't realized I'd lost. I went to movies alone, took long walks, found comfort in being by myself. And little by little, I started to feel whole again, piecing myself back together from the ruins of our relationship. Months passed, and one day, I received a message from him. Just a simple, "How are you?" I stared at it, a wave of old feelings rushing up before settling down. I realized, with a strange calmness, that I didn't need closure from him. I didn't need his apology or his explanation. I'd found my own peace, my own way forward. I deleted the message without replying, letting it go like a final weight lifted from my shoulders. Looking back, I can see that it wasn't all in vain. The experience taught me about resilience, about trust, and about the strength I had to rebuild myself when the foundation crumbled. Now, I know that love isn't about sacrifice to the point of losing yourself. And next time, I'll be ready, not just to love someone else, but to hold on to who I am, unshakable and whole. There was a quiet eeriness about that early morning walk. I'd taken to wandering the nearby park at dawn, partly for the peace of it, and partly because I'd started to crave a bit of space before the rush of my workday. The park was usually empty at that hour, with only the chirping of birds and the soft rustle of trees keeping me company. On this particular day, though, something was off from the beginning. I'd been following my usual route along the edge of the park, where the path met a small stream that twisted through the trees. I liked the familiarity of it, the way the same rocks and patches of wildflowers seemed to greet me each time. But as I rounded a bend, I noticed something strange. A large branch had fallen across the path. It hadn't been there the day before, and from the look of it, it had snapped clean off one of the trees overnight. I walked around it, feeling an odd sense of unease. Trees lose branches all the time, of course, but this one had come down hard enough to dig into the ground where it landed. I crouched down to examine it, and just as I did, I heard a cracking noise above me. I froze, glancing up in time to see another, even larger branch swaying ominously, the wood splitting right at the base. In an instant, instinct took over, and I jumped back just as the branch crashed to the ground with a deafening thud, right where I'd been standing. Heart pounding, I stared at the massive limb, realizing how close I'd come to being hit. The impact could have easily knocked me out, or worse. It was unsettling, not only because of the near miss, but because it happened in such a peaceful place, in the quiet safety of my morning routine. I looked around, the once familiar park now feeling different, as if it had more hidden threats than I'd realized. I continued my walk, but I couldn't shake the lingering tension, the awareness that things weren't as predictable as they seemed. The incident reminded me of another close call I'd had a few years back, one that had left a similar mark on me. I'd been on a road trip with my friends, driving down a mountain highway. We were all laughing, joking, lost in our own world, when I noticed a truck up ahead hauling a load of heavy lumber. As we approached to pass it, I glanced at the ropes holding the logs in place and felt a strange tug of dread. The ropes didn't look quite right, as if they were frayed, barely hanging on. I told my friend, who was driving, to slow down, and he laughed, saying I was overthinking it. But something in me insisted, so he reluctantly slowed just enough to put some distance between us and the truck. Not a minute later, one of the ropes snapped and a massive log slid off the truck, crashing onto the highway right where we would have been if we kept going. I still remember the sound, a sickening, thunderous crash that echoed in my bones. We all sat there in silence, staring at the log, realizing that if I hadn't asked him to slow down, we might not have made it. That close call stayed with me, a permanent reminder of how life can turn on a dime, how one small decision can be the difference between safety and disaster. After that morning in the park, I found myself thinking about the hidden dangers in life more often. I'd always considered myself careful, aware of my surroundings, but now I noticed things in a new way. One afternoon, I was at the gym, watching a guy load weights onto a barbell. He was stacking plates carelessly, barely securing them with the clips. I caught myself wincing as I imagined one of those plates sliding off mid-lift, crushing his foot or worse. I wanted to say something, but before I could, he set the bar down, thankfully avoiding any mishap. It struck me how often we walk around hazards without even realizing it, like the park or the lumber truck, or even my own kitchen, where I'd once nearly electrocuted myself trying to change a light fixture. I'd been sure I'd turned off the power, but a small shock told me otherwise. It wasn't serious, just enough to make my heart skip a beat, but it reminded me how easily a simple mistake could spiral out of control. A few weeks after the branch incident, I was talking to my neighbor, an older man named Larry, who spent most of his time in his garden. We'd never spoken much beyond a quick hello, but that day, he seemed eager to chat. He told me about how he'd once been a firefighter, and he shared stories about the dangers he'd seen on the job. One story stood out: a family that had left a space heater too close to their curtains on a winter night. The fire spread so quickly that by the time they realized, it was almost too late. They escaped, but barely, and the experience had left a deep mark on Larry. He looked at me, a serious glint in his eye, and said, "People think they're safe until they're not. You have to respect the risks, even when they're invisible." His words echoed in my mind long after that conversation. It was true. We think we're invincible, that we can manage everything with a little care and attention. But the truth is, life has its own way of reminding us that safety isn't guaranteed, that there are forces at work beyond our control. Now, I approach the world with a mix of caution and gratitude. I double-check things I used to ignore: the loose railing on my stairs, the gas line behind my stove, even the tires on my car before a long drive. I've become the person who carries a small first aid kit, who knows where the fire extinguisher is, who takes those what-ifs a bit more seriously. That morning in the park changed something in me. It was a small reminder of a much bigger truth, that in life, we're always a little closer to danger than we realize. And while I don't let it paralyze me, I let it guide me, a gentle nudge to respect the world around me, to appreciate the mundane moments, and to remember that sometimes the things that seem most ordinary can have the most profound impact. The invitation arrived out of the blue. A small, cream-colored envelope with elegant cursive handwriting spelling out my name. No return address, no sender. Just a mysterious invite to a celebration of life, with a date and time, and instructions to meet at a small chapel on the edge of town. I stared at it, trying to remember if I knew anyone in that part of town, but came up blank. There was no phone number to RSVP, no explanation, just that handwritten invitation and a vague sense of curiosity gnawing at me. Against my better judgment, I decided to go. There was something strange and oddly compelling about the whole thing. It was either the start of a good mystery or a great story to tell at parties. The chapel was almost hidden in the shadows of tall, old trees, the kind that looked like they'd seen more secrets than anyone would ever know. The whole place had a quiet, dignified sadness to it, like it was frozen in time. I parked, taking a breath as I looked around, trying to spot anyone familiar. I was early, so I was alone when I walked through the heavy wooden doors and into the chapel's dim interior. Inside, the place was small but beautiful, with soft light filtering in through stained glass windows that cast muted colors across the pews. There was a smell of old wood and faint incense, the kind that immediately made you feel reverent, like you'd stepped into some kind of ancient secret. At the front of the room, a framed photograph was set on a table, surrounded by flowers and a few candles. I squinted, trying to make out the face in the photo. It was a woman, maybe in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back into a neat bun and a warm, genuine smile that made her look both wise and kind. But I didn't recognize her. Not at all. A few minutes passed, and slowly, more people began to trickle in, mostly older folks, all dressed in dark, formal clothes. They murmured to each other, nodding politely, but no one seemed to notice me. I felt out of place, like I'd stumbled into someone else's life by accident. Finally, I tapped a woman on the shoulder, a lady with a kind, wrinkled face who looked like she'd seen her fair share of life. "Excuse me," I whispered. "I don't mean to be rude, but do you know who this is for?" She gave me a surprised look, but then smiled gently. "Oh, that's Evelyn Bell," she said, nodding toward the photograph. "She passed a few weeks ago." I blinked, racking my brain. The name didn't ring any bells. I'm sorry, I don't think I knew her." The woman raised an eyebrow, a curious smile playing at her lips. "If you got the invitation, dear, then you must have known her somehow." I thanked her and turned away, feeling more confused than ever. I racked my brain, trying to think of any possible connection, any random encounter that might have led Evelyn Bell to send me an invitation to her own memorial service. The small crowd settled into the pews, and I sat down at the very back, deciding I'd stay for the ceremony, if only to satisfy my curiosity. As the service began, the officiant spoke warmly about Evelyn, about her life, her love of gardening, her work as a school librarian. She was described as gentle and generous, a woman who saw the good in everyone and had a way of making people feel important. As the service went on, people began to share stories about Evelyn. One man, her neighbor, talked about how she'd always leave fresh flowers on people's doorsteps, just because. Another person mentioned how she'd kept a record of every book she'd read in her life, a list that filled 3 whole journals. Each story painted a picture of someone I would have liked to know, someone who cared about the small, beautiful details in life. But as lovely as these stories were, they didn't solve the mystery. I was still racking my brain, trying to connect the dots, when someone walked up to the front to read a letter Evelyn had written before she passed. I held my breath, leaning forward a little, hoping for some clue that would explain why I was there. The woman began to read, her voice soft and gentle. "To those I may have known only briefly, if you are here today, it's because you meant something to me. Maybe our paths crossed for only a moment, or perhaps we were strangers who shared a single, meaningful conversation. I've spent my life believing that even the smallest encounters have a purpose, that sometimes a single smile or a kind word from a stranger can change the course of a day, or even a life. I wanted to gather those people here, the ones who touch my life in ways they might never know. I wanted you to know that, even if our time together was brief, it mattered to me." As she read, a chill ran down my spine. I sat back, my mind racing through memories, faces, moments. Could it be? Was there some long-forgotten encounter with Evelyn that had slipped my mind but stayed with her? The idea felt surreal but strangely beautiful. The letter continued, describing how Evelyn had treasured these small moments, collecting them like tiny gems in the mosaic of her life. "Thank you for being part of my story," the letter concluded, "even if I was just a passing chapter in yours." When the woman finished reading, a hush fell over the room. I looked around at the faces of the others in the pews, each one reflecting the same sense of awe and quiet gratitude. It was like we'd all been given a gift, a reminder that sometimes the smallest moments mean the most. I stayed until the very end, lingering by the door as people left, wondering if maybe someone would recognize me or have some clue as to how I knew Evelyn. But no one did. I felt strangely disappointed and relieved at the same time, a mix of emotions I couldn't quite untangle. As I walked out of the chapel and into the afternoon sun, I kept replaying her letter in my mind. The idea that she'd noticed me, that I'd left some kind of impact on her life, was almost surreal. I couldn't stop wondering, what moment had meant so much to her? A random act of kindness? A smile in passing? Or had I been a small part of her story without even knowing it? The rest of the day felt different, lighter, like I was moving through the world with new eyes. I noticed the way people looked at each other, the little kindnesses exchanged between strangers, and wondered how many times I'd brushed past people who, even for a second, might have changed my life without me realizing it. Back at home, I took the invitation and pinned it to my wall. I didn't know Evelyn Bell, but she'd given me something, an awareness, a reminder to treat every encounter as though it might mean something. Because maybe, just maybe it did. From that day on, I tried to live with the sense that even the smallest actions mattered. Holding doors open, smiling at strangers, saying thank you like I meant it. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start, a way to honor the memory of someone I'd never really known, but who in her own quiet way had made a profound impact on my life. And maybe one day, years from now, someone will remember a small kindness I offered, and they'll wonder about me the same way. Last year, I took a job as a night cleaner for an office complex in the city. The hours were brutal, but I needed the cash, and the work was easy enough. The building was almost always empty, just me and a cart of supplies, moving from floor to floor, cleaning the offices one by one. The building was modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows and open layouts, but something about it felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a sense that it was somehow too quiet, like even the sound of my footsteps was swallowed up by the darkness. At first it was fine. I'd listen to podcasts, mop the floors, wipe down desks, do the same thing night after night. But then, things started to happen that I couldn't explain. I'd come into rooms that were spotless, only to find muddy footprints trailing across the floor when I turned around. Or I'd leave my cleaning supplies in one spot, only to find them on the other side of the room moments later. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I was tired working long hours in an empty building. Anyone would get a little jumpy. But one night, I was working on the 6th floor when I heard something strange. I was mopping the hallway when I heard the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down the corridor behind me. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps continued, drawing closer, one heavy step after another, like someone was taking their time, making sure I heard them. I turned around, my heart pounding, expecting to see one of the security guards or maybe someone who'd stayed late. But the hallway was empty. I waited a few moments, convinced someone had to be messing with me, but no one appeared. Finally, I went back to mopping, telling myself it was just the building creaking or my own imagination. A few hours later, though, I heard it again. This time, it was coming from the stairwell. It was that same slow, steady rhythm of footsteps moving up the stairs, pausing every few seconds like whoever it was knew I was listening. I tiptoed toward the door, pressing my ear to it, trying to convince myself I was just hearing things. But then, just as I leaned in, the footsteps stopped right on the other side of the door. I backed away, pulse racing, half expecting someone to burst through, but all I heard was silence. I forced myself to finish my shift, but every time I turned a corner, I felt like someone was there just out of sight, watching me. I started rushing through my tasks, barely bothering to mop or dust, too focused on just getting out. But just as I was about to leave, something made me freeze. I was about to step into the elevator when I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the metal doors, a dark shape standing at the far end of the hallway, right where I'd just been. I turned, but there was no one there, just the empty corridor stretching into darkness. I took the stairs that night, running down 6 flights without stopping, my heart racing the whole way. For a few nights after that, things were quiet. I convinced myself it was just nerves, that I'd let my mind play tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that building, like there was something watching me, something that didn't want me there. I started bringing a flashlight with me, even though the building was well lit, just in case. Then one night, everything changed. I was working on the 5th floor, scrubbing the bathroom sinks, when I noticed something odd in the mirror. At first, it looked like a smudge, a dark stain on the glass. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't a smudge. It was a face, faint and blurry, almost like it was trapped behind the mirror, staring out at me with empty, hollow eyes. I blinked, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but the face didn't go away. It was still there, watching me, its mouth twisted into a silent scream. I stumbled back, heart pounding, nearly tripping over my own feet as I backed out of the bathroom. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking, and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was just tired seeing things. But when I turned around, I saw them again, the muddy footprints leading from the bathroom door all the way down the hallway. They weren't mine. They were too big, spaced too far apart, like whoever made them was looming. And as I looked down that dark corridor, I felt a chill wash over me, the kind that sinks deep into your bones, making it hard to breathe. I don't know what possessed me to follow them, but I did, creeping down the hallway, one slow step at a time, until I reached the end where the footprints stopped. There, just outside the door to an empty office, I saw a piece of paper taped to the door. The words on it were scrawled in thick, jagged letters that looked like they'd been written in a hurry. "Help me." The words sent a jolt of fear through me, but I couldn't look away. I reached out, touching the paper, feeling the roughness of the ink beneath my fingertips. That's when I felt something cold, a presence standing right behind me, close enough that I could feel the chill of its breath on the back of my neck. I turned, but there was no one there, just the empty hallway, stretching out into darkness. I quit that night. I didn't even finish my shift. I just left the building, left all my supplies, and never went back. I didn't answer any of my boss's calls, didn't bother to pick up my last paycheck. Whatever was in that building, it didn't want me there, and I wasn't about to stick around and find out why. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that I didn't really leave it behind. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I'll catch a glimpse of something in the mirror. A faint face, watching me from the other side, its eyes hollow and dark. Or I'll hear those footsteps, slow and heavy, echoing in the hall outside my apartment. Last night, I woke up to the sound of breathing, just inches from my ear, like someone was standing over me, waiting for me to open my eyes. And when I did, I saw a shadow on the wall, a dark, twisted shape that looked like it was reaching out for me. I don't know how long it stood there, but eventually, it faded, slipping back into the shadows, leaving me alone in the dark. And now, I'm starting to wonder if I'll ever really be alone again. I don't know if I'll ever really feel safe again after what happened. I try to tell myself that it's over, that it's in the past, but no matter how much I try to convince myself, I can't shake the feeling that it's not. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, I swear I can feel it creeping back. A few months ago, I was working as a delivery driver for a meal service. It wasn't the best job, but it was flexible, and it paid the bills. I'd spend my nights driving around the city, dropping off food to people who, for whatever reason, couldn't get it themselves. Some nights were better than others. Most people were friendly, polite, and even tipped well. But every once in a while, I'd get someone who was different. People who made me uneasy, who left me with this strange feeling that something wasn't right. One night, I was assigned to make a delivery in a part of town I usually avoided. I didn't know much about the neighborhood, but I'd heard enough from other drivers to know it was rough. The streets were narrow, dimly lit, and full of dark, empty lots. But work was work, and I was used to odd hours and strange places, so I pushed the discomfort aside and drove out there. The address led me to an old, rundown apartment complex. It looked almost abandoned, with cracked windows and flickering lights in the hallway. I pulled up, grabbed the bag, and started up the stairs, trying not to think about how isolated the place felt. The stairwell was silent, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I could hear every step I took echoing against the concrete walls, every little creak and groan of the building settling. When I reached the apartment, number 303, I knocked and waited. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, trying to brush off the sense of dread creeping up my spine. Finally, I heard slow, shuffling footsteps approaching the door. When it opened, a man was standing there, staring at me with this intense, dead-eyed look. He looked to be in his 50s, but he was thin and wiry, like he'd been stretched out somehow, his skin pale and drawn tight over his cheekbones. For a second, neither of us said anything. He just stood there, watching me with an expression that was blank, but not, like there was something simmering just below the surface that I couldn't quite place. "Hi, I've got your order," I said, holding up the bag. He didn't respond. He just kept staring at me, his eyes scanning over my face in this slow, unnerving way. Finally, he reached out and took the bag, his hand cold and bony, brushing against mine for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said in this low, raspy voice that made my stomach clench. I managed a forced smile, mumbled something polite, and turned to leave. But just as I started to walk away, he spoke again. "Do you want to come inside?" he asked. I froze. The way he said it wasn't friendly. It wasn't like he was inviting me in for a drink or to chat. It felt wrong, like there was some hidden weight in his words, something I didn't want to understand. "No, thanks. I've got more deliveries," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I turned to leave, but as I did, I felt his gaze still on me, heavy and lingering. As I made my way back down the stairs, I felt my heart pounding in my chest, my instincts screaming at me to get out of there as fast as possible. I didn't look back, but the entire way down, I felt like he was watching me, following me with his eyes as I walked away. Back in my car, I tried to shake it off, chalk it up to a weird interaction. But as I drove away, I kept catching glimpses of something in the rearview mirror, a dark figure, standing in the doorway, watching me drive off. That should have been the end of it. Just another odd customer, another strange experience to laugh about later. But over the next week, I started getting strange messages on the app. You can usually text with customers for directions or questions about orders, but these messages were different. The first one just said, "It was nice to see you again." No name, no order attached. Just those words. The next night, another message came through saying, "Come inside next time. I'd like to get to know you." I reported it to the app support team, but they brushed it off, told me it was probably a glitch or a mistaken message. They deactivated the account, and I figured that was the end of it. But then, a few days later, I got another order. When I saw the address, 303, same complex, I felt my stomach drop. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that someone else must have ordered from the same apartment. But as I stood outside the door, holding the bag, that familiar sense of dread crept back in. I knocked. This time, no answer at all. I waited a minute, then placed the bag on the floor, turned around, and left, practically running down the stairs. Just as I got to the bottom, I glanced back, and I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the window, watching me. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound that made my blood turn to ice. Someone was knocking on my front door. At first, I thought I was dreaming. I lay there, barely breathing, listening to the soft, deliberate knocks, spaced out one after the other. It wasn't frantic or desperate. It was calm, patient, like whoever was on the other side knew I was there, waiting for me to answer. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and crept toward the door, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. When I looked through the peephole, my stomach dropped. There was no one there, just the empty hallway stretching out in both directions. I stood there for a long time, waiting, listening, convinced that any second, the knocking would start again. But it didn't. Eventually, I went back to bed, lying there in the dark, unable to shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The next day, I was exhausted but tried to shake it off as best as I could. I went about my routine, doing my best to forget about it. But then, as I was getting ready for bed, I found something that made my skin crawl. Sitting on the doormat outside my front door was a single plastic fork, the same kind we'd include with meal deliveries. It was clean, perfectly placed, almost like a calling card. I moved out of that apartment 2 weeks later, took a new job, and tried to start fresh. I don't do deliveries anymore. I haven't told anyone about this, not even my family. Sometimes I convince myself it was all in my head, that I was just being paranoid. But every now and then, I'll find myself looking out my window late at night, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching, waiting. And whenever I hear a knock at the door, I freeze, a part of me wondering if this time, he's come back for me.